The day Sandile Dlamini opened his eyes after weeks on the sickbed, the first thing he saw was not his wife's face. It was Lorato's trembling hands wiping the fever from his skin with a worn cloth. His wife had already left the room hours earlier, perfume still hanging in the air, her heels clicking away while the nurses whispered that a man like Sandile was finished. But the maid stayed. She fed him, turned him, prayed when his breathing grew thin. And when his wife finally said, "Let him die if he cannot stand like a man," Lorato heard every word. She just never imagined the broken man on that bed would one day ask her to become his wife. If this story finds you tonight, tell me your country and your local time in the comments. And if you love emotional stories filled with pain, hope, and justice, subscribe and stay with us. In Johannesburg, people used to speak Sandile Dlamini's name with a certain kind of respect that bordered on fear. He was not the loudest man in the room, nor the most flamboyant. He did not arrive with unnecessary noise, and he did not waste words trying to impress people who already knew what he had built. But when Sandile walked into a boardroom, conversations shifted. Men who had spent years pretending confidence straightened their backs. Women who had negotiated with ministers and international investors sharpened their arguments. He had that kind of presence, the kind that came not from inherited wealth but from a life spent earning authority one brutal season at a time. He was 52 years old, the founder and executive chairman of Dlamini Freight and Infrastructure, a company that had begun with 3 second-hand trucks and 1 rented warehouse on the edge of the city. Over the years, it had grown into a powerful enterprise, moving goods across provinces, managing construction, supply contracts, and building relationships with politicians, mining firms, and foreign investors. To the public, Sandile was the face of discipline, intelligence, and black excellence. Newspapers called him visionary. Young entrepreneurs quoted him online. Churches invited him to speak to men about responsibility, marriage, and legacy. No newspaper ever printed how tired he was. No magazine profile ever captured how quiet his home had become. The Dlamini estate stood in one of the wealthiest parts of Johannesburg, behind tall walls topped with discreet electric fencing with trimmed hedges, imported palms, and a driveway curved like something from an architecture brochure. The house itself was vast and polished, full of stone floors, glass surfaces, and expensive silence. It was the kind of place people admired from the outside and envied without understanding. Inside, every object had been chosen with care, and yet very little warmth remained. At the center of that cold elegance was Sandile's private bedroom suite, which had slowly turned into something halfway between a luxury room and a medical ward. 2 months earlier, while presenting in a closed strategy meeting with senior executives, Sandile had stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. At first, people thought he was pausing for emphasis. Then his pen slipped from his hand. His mouth twisted strangely. The right side of his body failed him before anyone in the room could even stand. By the time the ambulance arrived, one of the most powerful men in the city had become a limp, half-conscious figure on a stretcher, unable to control his own limbs or form clear words. The stroke did not kill him. Some said that was a miracle. Others, though they never said it in public, quietly believed it might have been kinder if it had. Recovery was slow, humiliating, and uncertain. After the first hospital phase, he was moved home under the advice of specialists, where private care was arranged, equipment installed, and an entire wing of the house reorganized around his condition. There was a hospital bed, oxygen, support, rehabilitation equipment, medications, sorted by hour adult hygiene supplies, hidden discreetly behind polished cabinet doors, and a schedule pinned inside drawers where guests would not see it. What guests did see was his wife. Nokuthula Dlamini moved through crisis the way some women moved through fashion shows, gracefully, strategically, always aware of who was watching. She was beautiful in the disciplined way. Money can preserve beauty, flawless skin, elegant posture, perfectly chosen clothes, a voice that could sound compassionate in public and dismissive in private, within the space of the same morning. She had married Sandile when his company was rising, when ambition still sparkled in him, and his hunger looked attractive rather than dangerous. Together, they had built an image that magazines loved: power, couple, black, success, charity patrons, business, and elegance in one marriage. Now, in the quiet of illness, the shine had begun to crack. The first weeks after the stroke had brought cameras, flowers, prayer chains, and public concern. Nokuthula received visitors in soft-toned dresses and controlled sorrow, thanking everyone for support. Speaking of hope, telling people Sandile was a fighter. She held his hand when pastors came. She stood near the bed when photographers from a business magazine visited for a carefully managed private family strength feature. She even cried once at exactly the right moment. But after the visitors left, the room changed. The tenderness disappeared first, then patience, then respect. It started with small things that were easy for outsiders to miss. The way she sighed when he took too long to swallow. The way she corrected nurses sharply if they mentioned improvement too early. The way she checked the time while doctors spoke as if illness itself were wasting her day. Then came the harsher changes. She began reducing staff hours. She complained about the cost of keeping specialists on call. She dismissed a senior private nurse after an argument over medication timing. She told the house manager that the entire household could not continue revolving around one broken man. The sentence moved quietly through the estate like smoke. Nobody repeated it in front of Sandile, but many heard it. Among those who heard far more than she was ever supposed to hear was Lorato Maseko. Lorato had worked in the Dlamini household for almost 11 months. She was 28, slim, steady-handed, and so quiet that many guests never remembered seeing her face clearly. She came from a township on the southern edge of the city where streets were narrow roofs, leaked in heavy rain, and most families knew what it meant to count food before the month ended. Her job in the estate was simple: on paper cleaning guest rooms, changing linen, serving tea when asked, helping in laundry when the household ran large events. She was not part of the family circle. She was not included in conversation unless someone needed something. Invisible people, however, often saw the most. Lorato noticed that Sandile's calls for help were sometimes answered late even when staff were nearby. She noticed that certain medications were no longer delivered on time after Nokuthula changed suppliers. She noticed that the specialists who had once been treated with urgency were now being asked whether every visit was truly necessary. Most of all, she noticed Sandile's eyes. They were not empty. That was the first thing that unsettled her. When the doctors and family spoke around him, assuming exhaustion had turned him into little more than a breathing shell, Sandile's eyes followed voices with painful alertness. When his wife entered, something darkened in them, not fear exactly, but a kind of humiliation too deep for tears. When staff rushed too quickly and handled him without gentleness, his gaze tightened. And when he was left too long in one position, uncomfortable and unable to protest properly, those same eyes carried a helplessness Lorato had seen before. Years ago, in a small government hospital that smelled of bleach and heat, she had seen it in her father. That memory never truly left her. Her father had died after an injury and a delayed chain of treatment that might have gone differently if he had been wealthier, louder, or simply more important to the right people. Lorato had still been a teenager then, old enough to understand that pain humbles a person but too young to protect him from it. Since then, she had carried a private sensitivity toward the sick, the kind that came from unfinished grief. Maybe that was why she could not harden herself the way the others did. At first, she told herself to stay in her place. When she brought fresh towels into Sandile's room and found him restless, she only adjusted the side table. When she noticed his water untouched and out of reach, she moved it closer. When a tray returned, half-eaten because feeding him took too much patience for the temporary aide assigned that afternoon, she said nothing at all. But the house was changing too quickly. One evening, as sunset cast long gold light across the polished hallway, Lorato stood outside the partially closed bedroom door with a basket of folded linens in her arms. Inside, a doctor was explaining the next stage of rehabilitation: speech, work-assisted, movement, consistency, hope. It was not a promise, but it was something. Nokuthula did not sound hopeful. "How long?" she asked coolly, "before this becomes realistic and not sentimental." The doctor paused. "Recovery after a stroke can be unpredictable, but he is responsive. That matters. Responsive." The word hung in the air. Nokuthula gave a soft laugh with no warmth in it. Responsive is not the same as living. Lorato froze where she stood. The doctor lowered his voice. "Mrs. Dlamini, he can hear more than people assume. Then perhaps hearing the truth will help him recover faster," Nokuthula replied. The linen basket suddenly felt too heavy in Lorato's arms. Inside the room, Sandile could not move much, but his eyes had shifted toward the sound of his wife's voice. There was no confusion in them, no vacancy, only the terrible silent knowledge of a man trapped inside his own damaged body, while the woman who had once shared his bed measured his worth against function. That was the moment something settled inside Lorato. Not rebellion, not ambition, just a simple, stubborn refusal to let another human being disappear while still alive. That night, after most of the household had withdrawn into its routines and the estate fell into its usual expensive stillness, Lorato passed his room again. She saw that the assigned aide had left early. The water glass sat too far away. His blanket had slipped. The bedside lamp cast a weak light across a face once known in newspapers and conference halls, now drawn with exhaustion and indignity. For a few seconds, she stood at the door, knowing she was crossing a line if she entered. Then she stepped inside. She moved quietly, adjusted the blanket, lifted the glass to his lips, and waited while he struggled to swallow. His eyes stayed on her the entire time, sharp with effort, pride, and something she could not yet name. Slowly she whispered. He swallowed again. Outside, the city moved on. Business deals continued, and people still spoke the name Sandile Dlamini with admiration. Inside that room, stripped of power, stripped of command, stripped even of easy speech, he had become dependent on the kindness of the one person in the house no one considered important. And neither of them yet understood that this quiet beginning would one day tear apart everything the Dlamini name had built. Lerato Maseko had learned very early that life did not break all at once. It cracked slowly. First in the places nobody saw, in the silences around a dinner table where there was not enough food for everyone to eat until full, in the long pauses between a mother's promises and the rent collector's pounding fist on the door, in the look a proud man wore when pain entered his body before money could enter his hands. By the time something finally collapsed, it had usually been falling apart for months. That was why, even as she stood inside Sandile Dlamini's room that night and held a glass of water to his lips, Lerato did not think of herself as someone doing something heroic. She thought only of what happens when people look away too long. Lerato had grown up in Katlehong in a narrow two-room house with a tin roof that shook in storms and walls that never fully kept out heat in summer or cold in winter. The neighborhood was full of stubborn life. Children played football in dusty lanes with half-flat balls. Women sold vetkoek, roasted corn, second-hand clothes, and phone credit at makeshift stands. Men left before sunrise for work that was often temporary, underpaid, and dangerous. At night, music sometimes drifted from taverns, mixing with barking dogs and distant arguments and the restless sound of trains. It was not a place the rich ever came unless their car broke down. But it was home. Her father, Sibusiso Maseko, had been a bricklayer whenever construction sites had work for him, and a repairman whenever they did not. He was not formally educated, but his hands knew how to make broken things hold again. He could patch leaks, build a shelf from salvaged wood, repair a gate, or mix cement with the patience of a craftsman. To Lerato, when she was little, his hands seemed capable of anything. He had large palms, a tired smile, and a quiet sense of dignity that poverty never fully managed to steal from him. Her mother, Thandi Maseko, sold cooked food near a taxi rank, rice, cabbage, beans, chicken feet on good days, only pap and gravy on bad ones. She worked with the endurance of women who do not wait for rescue because experience has taught them it is not coming. Between them, Lerato's parents built a life that was hard but not hopeless. There was laughter sometimes. There was Sunday church. There was tea shared in enamel cups. There were small celebrations on payday. There was the belief repeated often enough to sound sacred that their children might live differently. Lerato was the eldest. Then came her younger brother Sifo, bright-eyed and curious, forever taking apart broken radios and toy cars to see what lived inside them. For years, Lerato believed struggle was normal in the way children often do. She did not yet know that some families had enough food to leave food unfinished. She did not know that some girls worried about school dances instead of electricity tokens. She did not know that in certain homes, illness did not automatically threaten the entire future of a household. That knowledge came later. It arrived with injury. Her father fell from scaffolding at a building site when Lerato was 17. The fall was not from a dramatic height, not the kind that newspapers might describe with horror. It was only high enough to destroy a man's strength in the ordinary, devastating way that accidents often do. He injured his back, one leg, and something deep in his side that never healed properly. The contractor paid for almost nothing. Promises were made, then delayed, then forgotten. Forms disappeared. Phone calls stopped being answered. The pain changed him before poverty finished the rest. At first, Sibusiso insisted he would return to work within weeks. Then he said months. Then he stopped saying anything at all. He began spending more time lying down, one arm over his eyes, trying not to let his children hear him groan. The house grew quieter. Bills grew louder. Thandi worked longer hours. Lerato began missing school not because she lacked intelligence or interest, but because there were days the household simply could not function without her. She cooked. She cleaned. She helped her father sit up, stand, wash, and eat when the pain was too much for him to do it alone. That was when she first learned the humiliations of sickness, not from textbooks, but from watching a strong man apologize for needing help to reach a cup, shift his body, or use the toilet. What broke her most was not his pain. It was his shame. "Do not look at me like that," he had told her once after she helped him change sweat-soaked bedding. His voice was rough with embarrassment. "I am still your father." "You are," Lorato had answered softly. But she had gone outside afterward and cried behind the water drum because she understood what he truly meant. He was afraid that dependence would erase him. Months passed. Government clinics were crowded. Referrals took time. Medication ran out. A better doctor required money they did not have. A scan required money they did not have. Hope began to sound expensive. By the time Sibasiso's condition worsened sharply, the family had already exhausted neighbors' kindness, church donations, and every small loan that could be borrowed without becoming public shame. Lorato remembered the last week clearly because the details never stopped replaying in her mind. The smell of fever, the damp cloth on his forehead, her mother counting coins on the table at midnight, Sifo asleep in a chair, still wearing his school uniform because he had done homework until exhaustion took him, her father whispering, "I am sorry," as if dying poor were a personal failure. He passed away in a public hospital before sunrise on a morning cold enough that Lorato's fingers went numb while holding the metal rail of his bed. No official told them directly that he might have lived with better, faster care. People in places like theirs rarely received such blunt honesty. But grief has its own intelligence. It listens between sentences. It notices what was delayed, what was skipped, what was called unnecessary because the patient was just another poor man in pain. After the funeral, life did not pause to honor sorrow. Debt remained. Rent remained. Hunger remained. Lorato's final year of school slipped away, almost without discussion. There was no dramatic family meeting where dreams were sacrificed nobly. There was simply a point when it became obvious that fees could not be paid, uniforms could not be replaced, and someone had to bring money into the house immediately. That someone was her. She began, where many desperate young women began, with jobs nobody wanted and wages nobody could survive on alone. She washed dishes in a roadside cafe until the owner's son decided his hands lingered too long when he passed behind her. She left before the touching became worse. She cleaned offices at night for a subcontractor who sometimes delayed pay and called the women girls no matter their age. She worked in a laundry where steam coated the walls, and women stood for 10 hours with cracked fingers and swollen feet. She sold fruit by the road for a season. She cared for an old woman recovering from surgery until the woman's children decided they no longer needed paid help. Each job taught her the same lesson in a different form. Invisible people carry the weight of other people's comfort. And yet, somewhere inside all the exhaustion, Lorato kept a discipline that surprised even her. She did not grow hard in the loud way some people expected hardship to shape a woman. She did not become bitter in public. She listened more than she spoke. She watched. She remembered. She learned what people revealed when they believed someone beneath them was not really there. By 28, she had become good at making herself small without making herself broken. The job at the Dlamini estate came through a woman from church who knew one of the household staff. The pay was better than anything Lorato had earned before. There was a uniform. There were proper shifts. There was food from the kitchen, sometimes sent home at the end of events. Most importantly, the income was steady enough to help her mother, whose blood pressure had become unpredictable, and to keep Sifo in technical college where he was studying electrical systems with the fierce seriousness of someone who knew. Education was not a guarantee but a rescue rope. That was why Lorato endured the sharp hierarchies of rich people's homes. She did not love the way guests left glasses half full for others to clear. She did not love being spoken around. She did not love the way some visitors asked for things without ever looking into her face. But she had seen worse places. She had survived worse work. And for a while the Dlamini estate was simply a difficult but manageable world, polished, controlled, emotionally distant but orderly. Then Sandile fell ill, and something inside her old grief woke up. The first time she had to help reposition him after a temporary aid failed to return on time, her whole body had tensed with memory. The helpless weight of a man trying not to burden anyone. The careful movements required to preserve dignity where strength had left. The silence afterward when gratitude and shame mixed together in the air until breathing itself felt intimate. Sandile had looked at her then the way her father once had, not as a master looking at a servant but as a human being, stripped of every false layer and left with the unbearable need to trust someone. That look followed her. It followed her into the laundry room, into the servants' corridor, into the taxi rides home where city lights blurred across windows and strangers leaned against one another in tired silence. It followed her when she sat at the edge of her bed at night, listening to her mother's cough through the wall, and Sipho's late studying at the table. It followed her into prayer. She knew very well what people would say if she crossed the invisible boundaries of her role. They would say she was interfering. They would say she was trying to rise above her station. They would say no good ever came to women like her when rich families began to notice them too much. All of that might be true, but there was another truth she could not escape. She knew what abandonment looked like before death. She knew what happened when sick men became inconvenient. And she knew that once people begin treating a suffering person like furniture, cruelty rarely stops on its own. So when she entered Sandile's room in the quiet hours, adjusted his blanket, lifted water to his lips, and saw relief pass faintly through his tired eyes, Lorato did not feel brave. She felt haunted, not by Sandile himself, but by the memory of a hospital bed, a poor man apologizing for his own weakness, and a daughter who had been too young and too powerless to save him. This time, powerless or not, she was not going to stand by and do nothing. And though she still could not have imagined where that decision would lead, the choice had already begun shaping both their lives in ways neither wealth nor status would ever be able to control. If cruelty had arrived in the Dlamini household as shouting slaps or broken glass, it would have been easier to name. But what happened to Sandile was quieter than that. It came dressed in politeness, hidden inside decisions about schedules, staffing, budgets, and appearances. It wore perfume. It smiled at visitors. It lowered its voice in front of doctors and then sharpened it the moment the room emptied. In a house full of expensive objects, it moved like one more elegant thing, refined, controlled, and cold. Lorato began to understand that this was the kind of cruelty wealthy people preferred. It left no bruises anyone could photograph. At first, Nokuthula's changes seemed administrative. She said the household had to adjust to reality. She reviewed staff rosters with the estate manager cut overtime and insisted there was no reason for Sandile's room to remain staffed so heavily when he mostly slept anyway. She reduced the hours of the temporary aides who had been hired after his hospital discharge. The speech therapist's visits were trimmed from 3 times a week to 1. A physiotherapist who had been pushing for more aggressive movement support stopped coming after a disagreement no one explained clearly to the rest of the staff. The explanation given to everyone was cost discipline. Lorato knew enough to find that insulting. This was a home where imported flowers were changed twice a week before they wilted. A house where dinner parties used wine bottles that cost more than her mother's monthly medication. A place where one decorative lamp in the upstairs lounge could have paid Sipho's college fees for a year. To hear them speak of necessary cuts around Sandile's recovery felt obscene. Yet nobody challenged Nokuthula openly. Not the estate manager Jabulani, who was loyal first to salary and second to comfort. Not the senior housekeeper Mazwane, who had worked in wealthy homes so long she had learned that survival often required selective blindness. Not the security staff who stayed outside the emotional life of the family and preferred it that way. Not even the doctors, at least not directly. They spoke in recommendations, concern, caution. Nokuthula spoke in authority. And Sandile, trapped inside a body, still refusing him full command, could not yet do more than watch. His room became the center of a performance. When important visitors came, board members, a pastor, a family friend from Pretoria, an old political contact, Nokuthula transformed. She entered the room with measured concern, touched Sandile's shoulder, lightly adjusted a blanket for show, and spoke in that low, exhausted voice wives use when they want the world to admire their burden. He had a difficult morning, she would say, even if she had not been there. The doctors say patience is everything. We are trusting God. Sometimes she stood by the bed and sighed as if grief had hollowed her from the inside. Sometimes she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Sometimes she thanked people for their prayers with a fragile smile that made guests leave convinced they had witnessed devotion. Lorato often served tea during such visits. She entered quietly, placed cups on coasters, and stepped back into the silence rich people mistook for invisibility. From that edge of the room she watched things others missed. She saw Sandile's eyes shift away when Nokuthula spoke too sweetly. She saw his fingers twitch in agitation when guests praised her loyalty. She saw how his breathing changed after visitors left and the mask dropped. One afternoon, after a church elder and his wife had departed full of sympathy and admiration for Nokuthula's strength, the bedroom door clicked shut behind them. The smile vanished from Nokuthula's face so quickly it startled even Lorato, who by then had begun expecting it. She turned toward the bed. "You see," she said, smoothing the sleeve of her blouse. "This is what dignity looks like. At least one of us still has some." Sandile's eyes fixed on her. Lorato was in the adjoining dressing room, folding fresh towels. Through the partly open space, she heard everything. Nokuthula stepped closer to the bed, not lovingly, but with the impatience of someone standing near a problem she could not yet legally remove. "I am tired of people acting as if I should build my life around this room," she said. "Do you know how long this has gone on? Do you even understand what it is costing me?" Sandile made a sound, then small, strained, more breath than word. His throat was still unreliable, his mouth slow to obey him. Whatever he meant to say dissolved in effort. Nokuthula laughed once softly. "No. Of course. Now you want to speak." Lorato's hands stilled over the towel in her lap. She knew she should leave. She knew hearing these things placed her in dangerous territory. But some truths are so ugly that the soul refuses to walk away from them. Nokuthula moved to the side table and picked up a file. "The doctors still fill your head with nonsense. Improvement. Rehabilitation. Possibility." Her tone sharpened. "Do you know what possibility means for me? More waiting. More pretending. More people expecting me to sit in this mausoleum and smile while my life disappears." Sandile's eyes burned with something close to rage. Or perhaps it was grief. With him, those emotions had become almost indistinguishable. The room stayed silent long enough for Lorato to hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the sound of a car entering the outer gate. Then Nokuthula said the sentence Lorato would carry in memory long after everything else in the house changed. "You were useful when you were standing." Nothing in the room moved after that. Not the curtains, not the machine light beside the bed, not even Lorato's breathing for one suspended instant. Sandile stared at his wife, as if the last piece of denial had finally broken inside him. His eyes did not widen dramatically. They simply changed. Something closed. Something ancient and wounded withdrew deeper into him. Lorato had seen that look once before on her father's face when neighbors discussed hospital costs as if he were already beyond recovery. It was the look of a man hearing that his value had been reduced to function. Nokuthula, perhaps realizing how naked the sentence sounded in the silence, clicked the file shut. "Do not look at me like I am cruel," she said. "I am the only one being realistic." Then she turned and walked out. A few seconds later, the hallway echoed with the clean, confident sound of her heels moving away. Lorato remained where she was unable to fold another towel. When she finally stepped back into the room, she did it quietly, unsure whether Sandile would want anyone near him after such humiliation. He lay half-turned toward the window, the late afternoon light catching the gray now threading his hair at the temples. His jaw trembled once with effort. There was moisture in his eyes, but it did not fall. Lorato pretended not to notice. That was one of the first rules of preserving dignity. Not every wound needed a witness. "The blanket has slipped," she said softly, though that was not why she had come. She adjusted it with careful hands. Sandile's gaze moved toward her. It held shame, anger, exhaustion, and something like disbelief that another human being had remained in the room after those words. Lorato felt that look settle heavily on her, but she kept her face calm. "Would you like water?" she asked. His fingers moved slightly against the sheet. "Yes." She lifted the glass to his lips. He swallowed with difficulty, then again. A small amount spilled at the corner of his mouth. Lorato wiped it away without hesitation, the way she might have done for a child or an old man, or anyone whose body had betrayed them against their will. Slowly, she murmured. When he finished, he looked at her for a long moment. There are silences that say nothing, and silences that speak in whole histories. This one belonged to the second kind. Lorato could feel the weight of his humiliation, his gratitude, his anger at being seen this way, and his helplessness at being unable to command the room, as he once commanded boardrooms and contracts and men with far stronger bodies than his own. A knock sounded at the open door. It was Mazwane, the senior housekeeper, her mouth already set in disapproval. "Lorato," she said sharply. "The dining silver has not been finished." "I will come now," Lorato replied. Mazwan's eyes flicked to Sandile, then back to Lorato. The aides are supposed to handle him. Lorato knew that. The problem was that the aides were often absent now, or rushed or deliberately delayed by shifting instructions from above. "Yes, Mazwane." The older woman lowered her voice as she stepped closer. "Do not involve yourself too much. These rich people's troubles can swallow you whole." It was not unkind advice. It was frightened advice. Lorato nodded because argument would only invite more warning. After Mazwane left, Lorato turned back to the bed. Sandile's eyes were still on her. For the first time, she spoke to him as if she believed fully that he was not only hearing but understanding every word. "They are wrong to treat you like this," she said quietly. His expression tightened. "I know you can hear me." A pause. "I also know hearing is not the same as being able to answer." The corner of one of his fingers moved again, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Lorato took a slow breath. In another house with another family, she might still have retreated. She might have told herself she was a worker, nothing more. She might have protected her wages, her position, her carefully earned invisibility. But something had shifted too far now. It was no longer just about comfort. It was about neglect. And neglect, when wrapped in wealth and manners, could become a kind of violence. That evening, Nokuthula hosted two women in the downstairs lounge for wine and soft laughter. Music drifted faintly through the house. The kitchen staff prepared grilled salmon salad with imported cheese and warm rolls brushed with butter. Trays moved. Glasses clinked. Somewhere in the house, luxury continued performing itself as if suffering were just another room that could be closed. Upstairs, Sandile lay in a body that would not obey him. And Lorato, after finishing her duties, returned with a bowl of soup that had gone untouched at dinner and a fresh cloth for his forehead. No one had asked her to. No one would thank her if they knew. But as she stepped once more into that quiet room, she understood something with absolute clarity. Nokuthula was not merely tired of her husband's illness. She was withdrawing his humanity in stages. And if nobody resisted that withdrawal, one careful act at a time, Sandile would disappear long before death came for him. The human body, Lorato came to understand, could lose almost everything and still keep one final stubborn territory untouched. Awareness. It hid in the eyes first, then in the way silence reacted to certain names, then in the tiny desperate efforts of a hand trying to speak where the mouth could not. For weeks after that afternoon, when Nokuthula told her husband he had only been useful while standing, Lorato began paying closer attention to Sandile's smallest responses. She no longer entered his room as someone merely straightening sheets or moving trays out of the way. She entered with the alertness of a person listening for life beneath the ruins. And once she truly began looking, she could not unsee it. When she mentioned the weather, Sandile's face remained still. When she told him the jacaranda tree beyond the east window was beginning to shed purple blossoms across the drive, his eyes shifted briefly toward the glass and back. When she spoke his name clearly, there was always the faintest tightening in his brow, as though some part of him was straining upward through mud. When Nokuthula's perfume reached the room before Nokuthula herself did, his body changed in ways no doctor could have called imaginary. His breathing grew shallow. The fingers of his left hand curled inward, the line of his jaw set with effort. Lorato had seen enough now to know the difference between blank suffering and conscious humiliation. Sandile was still there, not half there, not dimly there, there. That knowledge changed everything. It also frightened her, because if Sandile could understand far more than everyone assumed, then every act of neglect carried greater cruelty than even she had first imagined. Every delayed response, every cold word, every conversation held carelessly above his bed, while people thought him too broken to follow. He was enduring it all awake. The house, meanwhile, continued pretending otherwise. Morning routines went on with polished efficiency downstairs. Cars came and left. Meetings were scheduled. Deliveries were signed for. Nokuthula received visitors in the sunroom, and sometimes spoke of Sandile in the past tense, without technically using past tense at all. He was always so driven, she would say. He never knew how to rest, or that was Sandile, always building, always moving. People heard nostalgia. Lorato heard preparation. Nokuthula was not grieving a dead man. She was rehearsing the social death of a living one. One Tuesday afternoon, when the estate was unusually still, and most of the senior household staff were occupied with preparations for a dinner Nokuthula planned to host later that week, Lorato entered Sandile's room carrying a fresh tray, thin porridge, mashed fruit medication, water, and a folded cloth. He was awake. That itself was no longer rare, but his eyes were sharper than usual, more focused, as if sleep had loosened some knot in him. The curtains were open, and sunlight reached across the bed in a long, pale strip. "Good afternoon," Baba Lorato said softly, using the respectful form that came naturally to her. "You should eat while it's still warm." She placed the tray on the side table, adjusted the head of the bed as the physiotherapist had once shown her, then sat on the edge of the chair beside him. She had learned to feed him patiently, never hurrying, waiting through each effort to swallow. The first spoonful went down slowly. The second took longer. By the third, Sandile's eyes were not on the food anymore. They had shifted toward the bedside cabinet. Lorato noticed. "What is it?" she asked quietly. His fingers moved small, strained the left hand, doing what the rest of him still could not. She followed his gaze. On the cabinet lay a folder left there earlier by one of Nokuthula's assistants, probably by accident. Inside were papers she had not touched. Household invoices, perhaps. Medical documents. Something legal. Lorato hesitated. "You want that?" His eyelids lowered once, then lifted. Not a blink. An answer. A strange chill moved across her skin. She picked up the folder and held it where he could see it. His eyes shifted immediately, fixed on a section clipped at the back. Lorato opened the file carefully. Most of the pages meant little to her at first glance: accounts, signatures, typed letters, medical correspondence, but one name repeated enough to catch even her untrained eye. Vuyo Kumalo. She had heard it before in passing. Nokuthula's cousin on her mother's side. A man who visited the estate without warmth, wore expensive suits too tightly across the chest, and smiled with too many teeth when speaking about family interests. He had started appearing more often since Sandile's illness. Lorato turned another page. This one bore company letterhead. She froze. Though she did not understand the full legal language, she recognized enough to feel danger in it. Acting authority. Temporary executive oversight. Signatory amendments pending medical incapacitation review. Vuyo's name again. Nokuthula's signature in the margin. She looked up at Sandile. His eyes were no longer merely alert. They were blazing. In that instant, more than in any effort to speak or move, Lorato saw the full force of the man he used to be. It lived there still, intelligence, pride, anger, command, trapped behind muscle and flesh that had mutinied against him. "You know about this," she whispered. His fingers pressed weakly into the sheet. "Yes." Lorato lowered her voice even further, though the room was empty. "They are changing things." His eyes did not leave hers. For a long moment her heart beat so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had entered many dangerous spaces in her life: unsafe jobs, late taxis, hungry months, where one missed wage could throw the household into panic. But this felt different. Bigger. Colder. This was the danger of money protecting itself. Sandile made a sound, then the rough scrape of effort deep in his throat. Lorato leaned closer. Again. His mouth moved with painful slowness. V. The sound died there. He closed his eyes briefly in frustration. Lorato felt something tighten inside her chest. Vuyo. His eyes opened at once. Yes. It was the first time she named something for him, and knew without question she had understood correctly. She swallowed. "He is involved." Another unmistakable blink. A tremor passed through Sandile's hand. Whether from rage or exhaustion, she could not tell. Lorato closed the folder and set it aside, suddenly aware of how exposed the room felt, how thin walls become when secrets start breathing inside them. She turned back to the tray and tried to steady her hands before lifting the next spoonful. "You must eat," she said gently, because she did not know what else to do with the shock of this discovery. He swallowed 2 more spoonfuls, then turned his face slightly away. Enough. She wiped his mouth with the cloth and gave him water. Outside, somewhere beyond the windows, a gardener's machine started and stopped. A bird struck briefly against the glass of the conservatory roof and flew off. The estate looked as calm as ever. Inside that room, the air had changed. After a while, Lorato asked, did Madame know, before his eyes held hers? Then very slowly, once more, he blinked. Yes. The answer did not surprise her as much as it should have. By then, she had already understood that Nokuthula's coldness was not temporary exhaustion. It had shape, direction, intention. Still, knowing she was not merely neglectful but actively involved in decisions about power and control made Lorato's skin crawl. A memory rose suddenly. Nokuthula standing downstairs days earlier in the formal lounge, speaking with Vuyo in low tones while thinking nobody important was nearby. He cannot remain chairman in this condition forever, Vuyo had said. Lorato had been polishing the console behind them, head bent, hands moving. Nokuthula answered, which is why timing matters, not noise, timing. At the time, Lorato had only understood the cruelty in the words. Now she understood the strategy. Sandile was not just being abandoned as a husband, he was being managed as an obstacle. That evening, Vuyo himself arrived. He came just before 6, stepping out of a dark sedan with the confidence of a man who already believed certain doors belonged to him. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, polished, with a voice built for false reassurance. He greeted the staff by name when it suited him, which some people mistook for kindness. Lorato had learned that the most dangerous people often remembered the names of those beneath them because it made control easier. From the upstairs corridor, carrying folded linen, she saw him enter Nokuthula's private sitting room. The door did not close fully. Their voices carried in fragments. "He board will support a transition if the medical review is strong enough. He still reacts, Vuyo. Reacting is not leading." A pause. Then Nokuthula. And the legal protections, Vuyo's voice dropped lower, but Lorato caught enough. By the time anyone challenges anything, it will all be formalized. She kept walking before her shadow could betray that she had paused. Later, when she returned to Sandile's room for evening care, she found him restless, eyes fixed on the door, as if he too had heard the familiar rhythm of Vuyo's voice in the house. Lorato checked the hallway, then stepped in and shut the door softly behind her. "I saw him," she said. Sandile's face tightened. "He came for Madam." A breath. "He thinks nobody knows." The room was silent except for the faint mechanical rhythm of the humidifier. Lorato stood at the bedside, hands clasped so tightly they ached. She knew she was crossing from compassion into something riskier now. Kindness alone had brought her this far. But knowledge always demands a second choice, whether to keep carrying it or put it down and walk away. "I am only a maid," she whispered more to herself than to him. "People like them can destroy someone like me." Sandile looked at her with a steadiness that felt almost unbearable, not because he demanded anything, but because in his helplessness, he was asking with his whole existence. Lorato thought of her mother's pills lined up in reused tins, Sipho's college fees, the rent, the cost of losing this job. She thought of how easy it would be to pretend she had seen nothing, understood nothing, suspected nothing beyond a rich couple's collapsing marriage. Then she remembered her father saying, "Do not look at me like that. I am still your father." Dependence had almost erased him before death did. And here lay another man being erased in real time, this one in silk sheets instead of a public hospital bed, but no less vulnerable for the luxury around him. Lorato exhaled slowly. "I do not know yet what I can do," she said, "but I will not act blind." Something softened in Sandile's eyes then. Not relief exactly, not hope yet. Those were still too large for the room they stood in. But there was recognition. The recognition of a man who had discovered that the one person everyone dismissed as unimportant might become the only witness he had left. Lorato adjusted his blanket, dimmed the lights, and placed the folder back exactly where it had been, careful not to invite suspicion too early. Before leaving, she turned once more toward the bed. "You are not alone," she said. The words were simple, maybe reckless, but the moment they left her mouth, she knew they were true. And somewhere behind Sandile's damaged speech, beneath the ruin of his body and the theft beginning around him, a battle had finally found its first ally. The storm began just after midnight. Not the gentle kind that drummed softly on windows and cooled the city before passing on, but the violent summer kind that seemed to split Johannesburg open from the sky downward. Wind hit the estate first, bending the palms at the edge of the driveway until their shadows looked like dark hands scraping at the walls. Then came the rain sheets of it, hard and relentless, rattling the long glass panels of the upper floor. A few seconds later, thunder cracked so close that the lights in the hallway flickered twice. By then, most of the household had already withdrawn into sleep. The kitchen had been cleaned. The last security round had been done. The staff wing was quiet, except for the hum of an old standing fan in the corridor, and the distant creak of pipes reacting to pressure. Downstairs, a lamp had been left on in the formal lounge, casting a weak amber pool across expensive furniture no one sat in after dark. Nokuthula had retired to her private suite earlier than usual, after an evening of phone calls and wine. The estate manager was off-site. One night, aide assigned to Sandile's room had asked to lie down for a few minutes after complaining of a migraine. She never returned. Lorato was awake because sleep had become shallow for her in that house. Ever since she had realized Sandile understood far more than people assumed, part of her mind remained listening even when she lay down. Listening for a missed bell, a shifting sound, a silence that lasted too long. She had learned that real emergencies were often preceded not by noise but by a strange interruption in rhythm. That night, what woke her fully was not thunder. It was the abrupt cutting out of the hallway, light outside the staff corridor, followed by the low, startled murmur of someone somewhere saying power. Then darkness swallowed the wing. A second later, backup systems kicked in for parts of the house, but not all of it. Emergency lighting glowed weakly at floor level in the passage, barely enough to orient the eye. Rain lashed the windows. Somewhere downstairs, an alarm beeped once and stopped. The old standing fan in the corridor died into silence. Lorato sat up on her narrow bed, heart already beating too fast. She did not know why, only that something felt wrong. She slipped on shoes, wrapped a shawl over her nightclothes, and opened her door. The corridor smelled faintly of damp air pushing in through unseen gaps. Another maid, Ayanda, stepped out from the room opposite, rubbing her arms. "Is the generator on?" Ayanda whispered. "Only partly," Lorato replied. A flash of lightning briefly lit the hallway white, then darkness closed again. And then Lorato heard it. Not a voice, not a call. Just a sound from far up the corridor toward the main bedroom wing metal, lightly striking metal, then stopping, as if something near a hospital bed had shifted and fallen. She did not wait. By the time she reached Sandile's room, the outer hallway light there was dead. Only the intermittent flicker of storm light through the window gave shape to the door. She pushed it open. The air inside felt wrong immediately. Too strained. Too urgent. Sandile was half-turned in the bed, more twisted than she had ever seen him. One arm caught awkwardly beneath him. The oxygen tubing had slipped away from his nose. A monitor by the bedside, usually dim and easy to ignore, was black. The power interruption had knocked part of the equipment offline, and whatever backup should have held had failed. In the darkness and broken light, Sandile's chest was moving too fast, too shallowly, as if each breath were fighting through a narrowing space. "Baba," she rushed to the bed. His skin was slick with sweat. His eyes were wide open. Not only open, terrified. Lorato's own fear rose so fast it nearly paralyzed her, but training from nowhere formal and everywhere painful took over. She had seen breathing distress before. In clinics, in overcrowded wards, in her father's final weeks when pain and weakness would climb into his chest and turn every inhale into labor. She checked the tubing, tried the machine, hit the power switch once, twice. Nothing. "Help," she shouted into the corridor. "Somebody come." No answer. The storm swallowed her voice. She turned back. Sandile's mouth was opening slightly now, trying to pull air that did not come properly. His throat worked. A wet sound formed low in his chest. Lorato's mind raced. The portable oxygen cylinder, there had been one. She had seen it in the side storage room used for medical supplies, small, kept for emergencies. She sprinted to the adjoining utility closet. Not there. Her breath caught. Then she remembered the physiotherapist had asked weeks ago for it to be moved to the secondary linen room after maintenance work. Down the hall, around the bend. Too far in that moment, yet the only chance. Leratoran. The corridor seemed longer than it ever had before. Emergency floor lights threw strips of pale glow along the baseboards. Rain hammered the windows with such force it sounded like handfuls of gravel. When she reached the linen room and yanked the door open, the smell of clean cotton hit her first. Then she saw the cylinder in the corner. It was heavier than she expected. She dragged it, then lifted arms, burning the metal, knocking once against the doorframe. By the time she got it back to Sandile's room, her lungs were on fire, and her shawl had slipped to the floor somewhere behind her. He was worse. His lips had lost color. "Stay with me," she said, though she did not know whether she was commanding him or begging him. Her hands shook as she fitted the tubing, checking the valve the way she had once watched a nurse do in a clinic years ago. Twist. Listen. Secure. Open slowly. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then air hissed into the line. She guided it into place. Sandile jerked once, then dragged in a harsher, deeper breath. Not steady. Not safe. But better. Lorato almost collapsed with relief, except the crisis was not over. His body was still rigid, one shoulder pulled awkwardly. She needed help to reposition him, to monitor him, to get a doctor to do all the things one person should never have to do alone in a house this rich. She ran to the doorway and shouted again, louder. This time footsteps came slow, confused. It was one of the security men, MFO, not even assigned, inside the medical wing. "What happened?" he asked, standing at the threshold as if the room itself might accuse him. "The machine failed," Lorato snapped. "Call Dr. Masalela now, and find the night aid." Now Mefo blinked rain-dark air moving behind him from the open stairwell. "The lines downstairs are restarting. Use your phone." That got him moving. He pulled out his mobile and stepped aside, trying to catch signal, muttering as he dialed. Lorato returned to the bed. Sandile's eyes had not left her. They were strained but conscious. A terrible awareness lived in them, the knowledge not just of pain, but of how close he had come to dying in a dark room while the household slept. "I know," she whispered. I know. She wiped sweat from his forehead with the edge of the sheet, then eased his trapped arm free and adjusted the pillows under his shoulder, the way the physiotherapist had demonstrated. His breathing remained rough, but less frantic now. The oxygen line trembled slightly with each inhale. A few minutes later, though they felt like half an hour, Ayanda arrived with a battery lantern. Behind her came the night aide, disheveled and blinking, claiming she had not heard anything because she had taken medicine for her head. Lorato looked at her once with such cold anger that the woman lowered her eyes immediately. Soon after, the private doctor called back. Lorato answered because no one else in the room seemed ready to think clearly. She described the symptoms in clipped detail: power interruption failed, bedside support, severe breathing distress, sweating, panic recovery after portable oxygen. The doctor's voice sharpened at once. I'm on my way. Check if his temperature is elevated. Keep him upright. Do not leave him alone. By the time Dr. Masalela arrived, the storm had not eased, but part of the estate's power had returned. Lights glowed again in sections of the hallway. Footsteps multiplied. Someone had finally informed Nokuthula. She entered Sandile's room in a silk robe and controlled alarm, her face arranged into offended concern. What on earth is going on? Lorato, kneeling near the bed, adjusting the cylinder line, looked up only briefly. The oxygen support failed when the power cut. He went into distress. Nokuthula's gaze snapped to the night aide. Where were you? The woman stammered something about migraine tablets and lying down. Doctor. Masalela ignored all of them and moved straight to the bed. He checked Sandile's pupils, chest sounds, pulse oxygen level responsiveness. The room grew very still around the crisp efficiency of his work. At last he exhaled and looked up grim. If support had been delayed much longer, he said, this could have become fatal. The sentence struck the room like another thunderclap. No one spoke immediately. Then Nokuthula pressed a hand to her chest. Thank God, she noticed, she said, turning just enough for everyone present to hear the strain in her voice. I told them all to stay alert tonight with the weather. Lorato stared at her. It was such a seamless lie that for a second the sheer audacity of it numbed her. Doctor. Masalela, however, was not interested in household theater. He straightened and said, whoever brought the portable oxygen and stabilized him likely prevented a much worse outcome. Ayanda's lantern light threw shadows across the room. Mfo stood silent by the door. The night aide looked ashamed. Nokuthula's eyes flicked once quickly dangerously toward Lorato. The doctor followed the glance. Was it you? He asked. Lorato hesitated, not because she wanted praise, but because the room had suddenly become political again. In another family, the answer would have been simple. Yes, she said at last. Doctor. Masalela held her gaze for one measuring second, then nodded. You acted fast. That was all. But Sandile heard it. Lorato knew because his eyes closed briefly, not with sleep, but with something deeper. Relief, gratitude, maybe even the release of knowing that what had happened to him in that darkness had not been swallowed by silence. The doctor ordered monitoring through the rest of the night, a full equipment review in the morning, and no unsupervised gaps in care. His tone toward Nokuthula remained formally respectful, but cooler than before. When the room finally thinned out again, and dawn began to gray, the edge of the windows, rain still falling in tired sheets now, instead of violent bursts. Lorato stood by the bed with aching arms and a pounding head. She had not sat down in hours. Nokuthula paused at the door before leaving. Get some rest when you can, she said smoothly. You've done enough. To anyone else, it would have sounded gracious. To Lorato, it sounded like a warning wrapped in silk. After she left, Sandile opened his eyes again and looked at Lorato with an intensity that made her chest tighten. In that gaze was more than gratitude now. There was memory. He would remember this night, the darkness, the failing machine, the absence, the one person who ran toward him instead of away. Lorato adjusted the blanket gently over him. Outside, the storm was passing. Inside the room, something had changed that no morning light could undo. Sandile had come close enough to death to smell it. And for the first time, other people in the house now knew, not privately, not in whispers, but as fact, that it was not his wife who had kept him alive. It was the maid. After the storm, the house did not return to normal. It pretended to. The lights came back fully by mid-morning. Wet footprints disappeared from the marble floors after the staff mopped the hallways dry. The failed equipment in Sandile's room was examined, replaced, and spoken about in clipped technical language that made the danger of the night before sound almost accidental. Breakfast was served downstairs. Deliveries arrived at the gate. Calls were answered. The estate resumed its polished rhythm with the determination of wealthy households that believe order itself can erase what nearly happened behind closed doors. But certain things once seen do not fold neatly back into routine. Lorato felt it first in the way people looked at her. Ayanda, who had arrived with the lantern during the crisis, now watched her with something between admiration and fear. Mfo, the security guard, gave her a small nod when they crossed paths near the service entrance, as if they were now tied by a secret that should not have existed in a house like this. Even the night aide avoided her eyes. Word had spread, not in an official announcement, of course, but in the only way truth moves through homes run by hierarchy and silence, through kitchen murmurs, lowered voices at sink edges, and the stretched pause that follows when someone enters a room mid-conversation. Everyone knew Sandile might have died. Everyone knew Lorato had been the one who acted. Nokuthula knew that everyone knew, and that more than the storm itself unsettled the house. For 2 days she behaved with perfect public composure. She instructed the estate manager to conduct a full review of emergency systems. She expressed sharp but measured disappointment in the night aide. She thanked Dr. Masalela for his prompt response. She even told one visiting cousin within easy hearing of the kitchen staff that thank God there are still observant workers in this world. The sentence sounded like praise. It was not. Lorato had grown up around women who knew how to lace poison into politeness. She recognized the tone immediately. Nokuthula was not grateful. She was containing damage. That morning, just before noon, Lorato was sent upstairs with a tray of tea and fruit for Nokuthula's private sitting room. She knocked, entered, and found her seated near the window in a cream blouse and fitted trousers, hair done, makeup flawless, as if the previous night had not ended with doctor's panic and the smell of rain in the bedroom wing. A laptop lay open before her. 2 mobile phones rested beside a notebook full of neat handwritten points. Nokuthula did not look up immediately. Put it there. Lorato placed the tray carefully on the low table. Only then did Nokuthula raise her eyes. They were calm. Too calm. You were very dramatic last night, she said. Lorato kept her expression neutral. Sir was struggling to breathe, madam. Nokuthula leaned back in her chair. Yes, that is what illness does. Lorato said nothing. Silence can protect the poor better than honesty ever does, but only when used carefully. She knew not to argue unless cornered. Nokuthula studied her for a long moment. People are talking. I don't know about that, madam. Don't insult me by pretending stupidity. Her voice remained soft, but the softness had sharpened. Staff are whispering. The doctor looked at you as if you had become something significant. Even Mfo seems to think he witnessed a hero. Lorato lowered her eyes respectfully, though her pulse had begun to beat harder. I only did what I could. And that, Nokuthula replied, is exactly where servants become troublesome. When they forget what they are allowed to do. The words landed with practiced precision. Lorato felt heat rise at the back of her neck, but she did not move. Nokuthula picked up her teacup and blew lightly across the surface before taking a sip. You work here. You are paid here. You are not family, not medical staff, not a decision-maker. I hope last night has not confused you. No, madam. Good. She set the cup down. Then we understand one another. Lorato murmured agreement and stepped back. As she turned to leave, Nokuthula added almost lazily, and one more thing. My husband is vulnerable. Vulnerable men become attached to the people who hover around them when they are weak. It creates misunderstandings. Lorato stopped. She did not turn immediately. I don't understand, madam. Nokuthula gave a small smile that did not reach her eyes. Then keep it that way. By the time Lorato left the room, she felt the conversation clinging to her skin like humidity. Not because she had been surprised, but because something had shifted more openly now. Nokuthula was no longer merely cold. She was marking territory. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of onions frying and baked bread warming in the oven. Mazwane stood over an inventory sheet with a pen tucked behind one ear, while 2 younger workers washed produce and argued softly about taxi fares. The ordinariness of it all almost felt unreal after the tension upstairs. Mazwane looked up as Lorato entered. You're late. Madam wanted to speak. Mazwane clicked her tongue but did not press. Instead, she handed Lorato a stack of pressed napkins for the evening service. After a moment, in a lower voice, she said, Keep your head down. It was the second warning from the older woman in as many days. Lorato nodded. But keeping one's head down becomes difficult once a house starts watching. In Sandile's room, the atmosphere had changed too. The new emergency equipment had been installed. Backup lighting was checked. The portable oxygen cylinder stood in a clearly marked place. No one could pretend to forget again. Dr. Mazalela had increased monitoring and insisted on stricter timing for medication and movement therapy. Whether from professional conscience or quiet suspicion, he no longer seemed willing to trust household assurances alone. Sandile himself looked exhausted but more present than before. Something about surviving that night had sharpened him. His gaze followed people more deliberately. When staff entered and exited, he seemed to catalog them. He watched the timing of things, the order of voices, the names attached to decisions. He remained trapped in a body that frustrated him, but his mind no longer floated helplessly through the room. It had begun gathering itself. Lorato noticed it during the afternoon feeding. He swallowed more steadily than before, though still slowly. His left hand, the one that retained better movement, twitched toward the spoon twice, as if trying to reclaim some small piece of agency. When she adjusted the pillow behind his shoulder, he held her gaze with unusual intensity, then shifted his eyes toward the doorway and back. He wanted to say something. Lorato set the bowl down. "You're tired?" she asked. "No." "You're in pain?" A pause. Then a faint movement of the fingers. "Not exactly." She thought for a moment. "Someone spoke to you." His eyes sharpened. "Yes." It was not hard to guess who. "What did Madam say?" Lorato whispered, then immediately regretted the question. He could barely form sounds. Asking him for full meaning felt cruel. Still, Sandile tried. His mouth moved. His throat strained. The sound broke apart. Lorato leaned closer. Lorato. His eyes closed once. Opened. Yes. Her chest tightened. Before the storm, she had been the person who fed him, turned him, adjusted his sheets. After the storm, something had crossed an invisible line. He knew her now, not merely as a worker moving around his illness, but as the person who had stood between him and death in the dark. That knowledge was dangerous. It was also human. Lorato kept her voice gentle. "It's all right." He looked at her as if the words were both comfort and insult, because nothing was all right and both of them knew it. She tried again. "You're safe right now." That was truer, though not fully true either. He exhaled slowly through his nose, the closest thing to surrender she had seen in him. Later that evening, as sunset bled orange over the city and the downstairs lights came on in stages, Nokuthula hosted 2 women from a charity board in the formal lounge. Laughter drifted upward, soft and polished. One of the women said loudly enough to be heard from the passage, "You've been so strong through all this, Nokuthula. I don't know how you do it." Nokuthula replied in a voice sweet enough to rot fruit. "One simply does what love requires." Lorato nearly stopped in the hallway, carrying folded linens. Inside Sandile's room, she found his eyes open and fixed toward the door. He had heard it too. For one suspended moment, anger moved plainly across his face, not loud but unmistakable. The muscles he could not command fully still betrayed him in fragments. His jaw tightened. The hand on the sheet curled inward. The look in his eyes was that of a man listening to his own betrayal performed as virtue downstairs. Lorato crossed the room and quietly closed the door. The muffled laughter became softer. She turned back. "Rest," she said, though the words sounded inadequate. Sandile's gaze remained on her. Then, with immense effort, he moved his left hand again, not far, not gracefully, just enough to shift it against the blanket. Lorato stepped closer, uncertain. His fingers inched once more. Only then did she understand. He was reaching. Not for the water, not for the blanket, for acknowledgement, for contact, for proof that the world inside this room had not become entirely false. Very carefully, after the briefest hesitation, Lorato placed her hand lightly over his. His skin was warm and dry now, not fevered like during the storm. His fingers could not close properly, but they pressed faintly against hers. Neither of them moved. The moment was small, almost invisible. If anyone had opened the door, it would have looked like nothing, a maid reassuring a patient. Yet within it lived a shift so profound that Lorato felt it in her bones. Sandile Dlamini, once a man who signed contracts worth millions, who commanded rooms without raising his voice, who had spent a lifetime being the one others depended on, had reached for her because words were still failing him, and she was the marker, only person in the house whose presence no longer felt like performance. Lorato withdrew first gently. "You must save your strength," she said. But she knew the truth. The strength he was trying to save now was not only physical. It was identity, will, Witness. For days, the doctors had been measuring progress in blood pressure, swallowing reflex, and muscle response. Those things mattered. But the deeper change happening in that room was harder to chart. Sandile was beginning to fight his way back, not only toward movement but toward recognition, toward naming what had been done to him, toward choosing who remained near him, toward reclaiming the authority illness had stripped from his body. And the first sign of that return came the next morning. Dr. Masalela had just finished a brief assessment. Lorato stood by with a glass of water while the doctor asked simple prompts meant to stimulate speech. Name, time, pain, breathe. Again, slowly. Sandile struggled, jaw working, eyes narrowed with effort. Can you say your name? The doctor asked. Nothing clear came. That's all right. Again. Sandile swallowed, tried once more. A harsh sound emerged, fragmented and incomplete. The doctor nodded encouragingly. Good. Keep going. His eyes shifted then, not to the doctor, not to the window, not to the machines, to Lorato. His mouth moved. Le. The room held still. Doctor. Masalela looked up. Sandile tried again, drawing from some deep place of will. Le. Lorato forgot to breathe. One more effort. One more painful pull against weakness and humiliation and damaged muscle. Lara. 2. The word was broken, breathy, rough with strain, but unmistakable. Silence filled the room after it. Even the doctor did not speak for a second. Then he smiled, startled and impressed. Very good, Mr. Dlamini. But Lorato barely heard him, because Sandile's eyes were still on her, and in them was something new, not only gratitude, not only dependence, but recognition, made public at last. From that moment, the house would never see her the same way again, and neither would Nokuthula. By the end of that morning, the whole house knew. Not because Dr. Masalela announced it to the staff, and certainly not because Nokuthula would ever have allowed such a thing to be celebrated openly, but news in rich houses traveled the same way it traveled everywhere else in the world, through astonishment, through the widened eyes of people who had witnessed something they knew would matter, through the trembling urgency of whispers passed from one corridor to another before caution could catch them. Sandile Dlamini had spoken, and the first name he had managed to say was not his wife's. It was Lorato's. The fact moved through the estate like a hidden fire. In the laundry room, Ayanda repeated it under her breath while sorting pressed shirts, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. In the kitchen, one of the younger staff nearly dropped a stack of plates when Mazwan silenced the room with a hard look after hearing two maids speculate whether Sandile had always felt more comfort with Lorato nearby. At the security gate, Empho said nothing, but his expression when Lorato passed him later that day told her enough he had heard, and he understood the danger of what it meant. What nobody said openly was what every thinking person in the house already knew. A sick man might call many names in weakness, but the first name spoken after silence is rarely accidental. Lorato felt the shift almost immediately. People watched her more closely now. Some with sympathy, some with curiosity, some with the crude interest human beings reserve for the possibility of scandal. She could sense it in the slight hush that fell when she entered a room unexpectedly, in the unfinished sentences, in the glances that flicked toward her uniform and then away. The estate had always been full of hierarchy. Now it was full of suspicion, too. The suspicion did not wound her only because it was unfair. It wounded her because she knew how quickly people could turn kindness into something dirty when class stood in the way. That afternoon, while clearing cups from the upstairs sitting room after one of Nokuthula's brief meetings with a charity committee member, Lorato heard laughter from the hallway before she saw the speakers. Two of the junior domestic workers, girls younger than her, both employed only a few months, were leaning near the linen cabinet. I'm just saying. One murmured, not knowing Lorato was close enough to hear men know what they want even when they're sick. The other gave a half-smothered laugh. Or maybe especially when they're sick. Imagine. From chairman's wife to housemaid drama. These rich people, Lorato, stepped into view before the sentence finished. Both women straightened so fast they nearly knocked the cabinet door shut with their hips. Afternoon Cece, one muttered, eyes lowered. Lorato did not answer immediately. She looked at them both, not with anger, but with something heavier. Disappointment. Weariness. The quiet hurt of someone realizing how little the truth mattered once gossip scented blood. At last, she said, if you speak about things you do not understand, make sure the people concerned are not the ones cleaning up after your words. Then she walked past them. Her hands remained steady until she reached the service staircase. Only there did she pause and grip the rail, breathing through the heat behind her eyes. It was not the first insult life had offered her. and it would not be the worst. But she knew too well the shape of such talk. It began with jokes. It grew into assumptions. Then judgment arrived, dressed as certainty. A poor woman did not have to do anything wrong to become guilty in the imagination of others. She only had to be noticed. Downstairs, the house moved through evening preparations. Nokuthula was hosting a small dinner that night. Nothing grand, only 4 guests, but enough to require polished silver fresh flowers and the precise choreography of staff she liked to command when needing to reassert control. Lorato was told to assist in the dining room rather than the bedroom wing, a change so sudden and deliberate that even Mazwane glanced at her with concern before issuing the instruction. "Madam wants Ayanda upstairs tonight," the older woman said, not looking directly at Lorato while checking a stack of folded napkins. "You'll stay in service here." Lorato understood immediately. Nokuthula was separating her from Sandile. A cold unease moved through her, but she kept her face composed. "Yes, Mazwan." The older woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Do not challenge it. Not here." Yet all through the early evening, as Lorato laid table settings under the chandelier's soft golden light and carried platters in and out of the warming kitchen, her attention kept lifting toward the upper floor. She imagined Ayanda in Sandile's room, well-meaning but inexperienced, easily flustered, too afraid of doing wrong to notice small needs unless someone told her plainly. She imagined Nokuthula counting on exactly that. At 7:30, guests arrived. One was a local politician who had once publicly praised Sandile's business leadership. Another was a woman from an investment board who wore pearls and spoke with the careful charm of people who survive by appearing sincere. The other 2 were longtime social acquaintances of Nokuthula's women, who carried expensive handbags and seemed to think private tragedy made suitable dinner conversation, so long as the napkins were good linen. From the edge of the dining room, refilling glasses and replacing side plates, Lorato listened as the talk turned where she feared it would. "How is Sandile really?" one guest asked, lowering her voice just enough to suggest intimacy without true compassion. Nokuthula sighed gently. "Some days are better than others." "And his speech improving," Nokuthula said, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "But recovery is complex. Emotional dependency becomes part of it." Something in her tone made Lorato's stomach tighten. The woman with pearls leaned in slightly. "That must be difficult." Nokuthula gave a weary little smile, the one she used when inviting pity while pretending modesty. "You would be surprised how vulnerable powerful men become. They cling to whoever is nearest, nurses, aides, staff. It is not personal, of course, just part of the condition." The table murmured with understanding. Lorato nearly dropped the water jug in her hand, not because the insult was direct. Nokuthula was too clever for that in front of guests, but the meaning was sharp enough. Sandile had spoken Lorato's name, yes, but according to Nokuthula, it meant nothing. Only the random attachment of a broken man, a medical side effect, a symptom to be managed. Lorato kept her face still and moved to the next guest. Inside, something twisted hard. She thought of Sandile struggling through damaged speech to form her name one syllable at a time, thought of the fear in his eyes during the storm, thought of his hand reaching for hers, not with desire, not with confusion, but with the desperate dignity of a man trying not to vanish in his own house. To hear that reduced to dependency made her feel physically sick. When dinner finally ended and dessert was served in the lounge, Lorato slipped briefly into the back corridor leading to the stairs. She did not intend to disobey orders, at least that was what she told herself, but she needed just for a moment to know whether Sandile was all right. The hallway upstairs was dimmer than usual, most lights lowered for the night. Ayanda emerged from Sandile's room carrying an untouched bowl of soup. "He won't eat," she whispered when she saw Lorato. "How long has he been like that? Since after 6? He keeps looking at the door." Ayanda hesitated, then added quietly, "I think he's waiting for you." Lorato closed her eyes for the briefest second. "This is your assignment tonight," she reminded the younger woman gently. "I know, but he won't take more than water." Through the slightly open door, Lorato could see the edge of the bed, the shadowed outline of Sandile's shoulder against the pillows. She should have turned away. Instead, she stepped in. He was awake. The moment he saw her, something changed in his expression so quickly and so visibly that it hurt to witness. Tension loosened, not fully, not enough to become peace, but enough to show he had indeed been waiting. Lorato moved to the bedside, lowering her voice. "I can only stay a minute." His eyes held hers. On the tray, the soup sat cooling beside untouched medication. She checked the water, adjusted the blanket, then glanced toward the corridor to make sure Ayanda remained on watch. "You need to eat," she whispered. Sandile tried to form a sound. Failed. Tried again. "Lay." She leaned closer. "Don't strain." He frowned with effort, then shifted his gaze toward the door, then back to her, then toward the soup. A simple sequence, but enough. "You were gone. I could not eat." The understanding of it broke something soft inside her. Not romance. Not anything so reckless. Something sadder and more human than that trust. Lorato picked up the spoon. Only a little. She fed him 3 careful spoonfuls, then 4. His swallowing was slower tonight, his body more fatigued, but he accepted the food in a way Ayanda said he had refused before. When she offered water, he drank. When she adjusted his position, his breathing eased. A knock came softly at the door. Ayanda's voice. "Madam is asking where you are." Lorato set the spoon down immediately. Sandile's hand moved weakly against the blanket. She looked at it, then at him. The need in his eyes was unmistakable. Not childish, not possessive, only deeply afraid of being left again to people who treated his personhood like inconvenience. Lorato forced herself to speak firmly, though her throat had tightened. "I have to go." His fingers stilled. "I will come back when I can." It was a promise she had no right to make. Yet she made it anyway. When she returned downstairs, Nokuthula was standing alone near the hallway arch guests, still laughing faintly in the lounge behind her. Her face wore a smile so controlled it looked almost serene. "Where were you in the upstairs corridor, madam?" Ayanda said. "I know what Ayanda said." Nokuthula stepped closer. "You seem to forget very easily." Lorato lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry, madam." "No," Nokuthula replied softly. "You are becoming confident." The accusation was worse for being spoken so quietly. Lorato did not answer. Nokuthula studied her for a long moment, then said, "There are girls like you in every large house. Girls who mistake proximity for importance. It never ends well. A lesser woman might have slapped her. A cruder woman might have shouted. Nokuthula did neither. She simply let the words settle like poison in clean water. Lorato stood still until she was dismissed. Much later, after the guests were gone, the silver washed the floors checked, and the service wing dimmed for the night, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, unable to sleep. Outside, the estate was silent again, rich and watchful, and full of danger disguised as order. She thought of what people were beginning to say. She thought of how quickly her name could be dragged through mud if Nokuthula chose. She thought of her mother, her brother, her wages, the small, fragile structure of obligation that her job supported. And still behind all those fears, one truth remained impossible to escape. If she stepped back now, Sandile would know it was not because she wanted to, but because the house had succeeded in isolating him. That perhaps was exactly what Nokuthula intended. Lorato lay down at last, but sleep did not come easily. Above her, in a room too large for suffering and too cold for mercy, a man who had once ruled boardrooms now waited for kindness from the one person everyone else believed should know her place. And below that same roof, whispers were already turning that kindness into shame. By the second week after Sandile spoke Lorato's name, the struggle inside the Dlamini household had outgrown the bedroom. It had reached the boardroom. Not openly at first. Power, like cruelty, rarely announced its full shape before it was ready. It moved in drafts, private calls, revised memos, quiet signatures, and carefully chosen language that turned betrayal into procedure. But Sandile had lived too long in the world of business not to recognize the smell of a takeover when it began to gather around him. Even from his bed, even through weakness and broken speech, he could feel it. Lorato saw the signs before she fully understood them. More envelopes began arriving by courier marked urgent and confidential. The estate manager, Jabulani, started taking calls in the corridor just outside the medical wing, lowering his voice whenever staff passed. Vuyo Kumalo visited more frequently, no longer bothering to space out his appearances like a polite relative checking in. He came in dark suits, carrying leather folders and speaking with the smooth impatience of a man who believed the future already belonged to him. Twice, Lorato saw him leaving Nokuthula's sitting room with company papers under his arm. The first time she told herself not to look too closely. The second time, she knew she no longer had the luxury of pretending not to understand. On a warm Thursday afternoon, Dr. Masalela had just finished Sandile's exercises and left instructions for the next round of medication when a call came from the main office downstairs. Nokuthula wanted the staff to prepare the smaller conference room in the East Wing, not the formal boardroom at company headquarters. There would be a private executive consultation that evening. Refreshments only. No interruptions. No unnecessary staff movement in the corridor. The wording alone made Lorato suspicious. The East Wing conference room was rarely used for anything that mattered publicly. It was for conversations people wanted to keep close conversations easier to deny later if needed. Mazwane sent Lorato and Ayanda to help prepare it. The room itself was elegant in the controlled masculine style Sandalay favored for private business. Dark wood, a long polished table, leather chairs, muted art on the walls, discreet lighting, and a recessed screen hidden behind paneling. Lorato laid out glasses, bottled water, coffee service, and neatly arranged notepads with the company insignia embossed in gold. Ayanda adjusted the blinds. Neither spoke much, but when they were nearly done, Ayanda leaned close and whispered, "Why not at headquarters?" Lorato did not answer at once, because the same question had already formed in her own mind. Before she could decide whether to speak, footsteps sounded in the hall. They stepped back immediately. Nokuthula entered first, followed by Vuyo and two men Lorato recognized from framed photographs in the estate study and from newspaper coverage, members of the company board. Not the strongest of them, not the oldest allies Sandile trusted most, but influential enough. "Leave the coffee," Nokuthula said without looking at the maids. "Then close the door behind you." Lorato lowered her eyes and obeyed. Yet as she reached the corridor, she noticed one folder left on the side credenza near the door separate from the others. It had likely been placed there temporarily by one of the men, while greeting the rest. The cover bore Dlamini Frieden Infrastructure letterhead, and a title visible in bold, Interim Governance Continuity Proposal. The words hit her like cold water. She kept walking, not because curiosity had faded, but because survival had taught her how dangerous one extra second of visible interest could be. That evening, once dinner service had ended and most of the household settled into strained, quiet, Lorato took Sandile his medication. He was more tired these days after therapy sessions, but his eyes remained fiercely alert. When she entered, she found him watching the door as if measuring time itself. "There was a meeting," she said softly after checking the hallway. His expression changed at once. She moved closer. "In the East Wing. Madam, Vuyo, two board members." Sandile's jaw tightened. Lorato set down the medicine cup and lowered her voice further. "I saw a document. Governance continuity. Interim something." His breathing deepened slightly, not from weakness this time, but from anger. He tried to speak. Failed. Tried again. Board. "Yes," Lorato said. He shut his eyes for one brief second, then opened them. A terrible frustration radiated from him. Before illness, this would have been his terrain: documents, meetings, shifting loyalties, the scent of ambition disguised as corporate concern. Now others handled his fate while he lay upstairs fighting to shape broken words. Lorato had never known much about high business, but poverty teaches people to recognize motive quickly, and motive in rich spaces often wore polished language. "They want your position," she whispered. Sandile's fingers moved once on the sheet. "Yes." Something heavy settled in her stomach. It was one thing to suspect a wife's coldness. It was another to realize that the machinery of money and corporate power had already begun moving around a man not yet dead. The next morning proved how far it had gone. A courier arrived before 9 with more files. Jabulani personally delivered them upstairs, not to Sandile's room, but to Nokuthula's private office. Half an hour later, Vuyo returned. This time he stayed longer. Lorato, carrying pressed towels from the laundry, passed the study corridor just as the door stood slightly ajar. She did not mean to listen. She meant only to keep walking. Then she heard Sandile's name. Legally, one of the board men was saying the issue is capacity. If the medical review states he cannot exercise executive judgment consistently, then interim authority is defensible. "And if he improves?" Nokuthula asked. Vuyo answered before anyone else could. "Then we revisit. But by that stage, operational control will already be stabilized." Stabilized. Lorato almost hated the word for how clean it sounded. Another voice, older, more cautious, spoke up. "We must be careful. Sandile has loyalists. If they believe this is opportunistic," Nokuthula cut in smoothly. "It is not opportunistic. It is necessary. The company cannot float on sentiment." The conversation moved lower, then too low for every word to carry, but Lorato had heard enough. She walked on before her presence could be noticed, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. By midday, she was certain of one thing: they were trying to push Sandile out under the cover of illness. But certainty alone was useless if it could not be turned into something that mattered. That chance arrived where she least expected it. Later that afternoon, while tidying the upstairs library, a room rarely used now except by dust and memory, Lorato found a stack of old files on the side table near Sandile's favorite reading chair. Some had likely been brought in months earlier when he still worked from home between meetings and never removed after the stroke. Most were harmless annual reports, shipping route summaries, infrastructure proposals. Then one folder slid open in her hands. Inside was correspondence bearing a familiar name, Themba Ndlovu. The letterhead identified him as senior legal counsel to Sandile personally, not merely to the company. Several pages concerned trust structures, temporary authority, and protective clauses in the event of incapacity. Lorato did not understand all the legal language, but one sentence stood out clearly enough for even her untrained eye. No interim transfer of executive control shall be deemed valid without direct confirmation by Mr. Sandile Dlamini, or designated independent legal witness. She read it twice, then a third time. A designated independent legal witness. Not Nokuthula, not Vuyo, not a quiet meeting in the East Wing over coffee. Her pulse quickened. She turned the page and found contact details for Themba Ndlovu, including a mobile number handwritten in the margin beside a note in Sandile's own unmistakably bold script from an earlier time. Call Themba first. Lorato stared at the handwriting so long that for a moment the room disappeared around her. It felt like hearing a voice from before illness had swallowed the house. She closed the folder carefully, hands trembling now for an entirely different reason. This was not proof of everything. But it was a thread. A real one. She waited until evening to tell Sandile, partly from caution, and partly because she needed time to think clearly. What if she misunderstood? What if the letter was outdated? What if using it placed her in direct danger? Yet underneath every fear was another truth. Doing nothing was becoming its own kind of betrayal. When she entered Sandile's room with his supper tray, he looked tired and frustrated, as if the whole day had passed in silence, too thick for him to break. She checked the hall, closed the door, and stood close enough that she would not need to speak above a whisper. I found something. His eyes sharpened immediately. In the library. Old files. She took a steadying breath. A legal letter. From a man called Themba Ndlovu. The change in Sandile's face was instant and unmistakable. Relief. Not complete, not safe, but real. You know him, Lorato said. A clear blink. Yes. He is your lawyer again. Yes. Lorato nodded, feeling both encouraged and more frightened now that she knew she was stepping into something concrete. The letter said no interim transfer of control without your confirmation, or an independent legal witness. Sandile's breathing deepened. His left hand moved urgently against the blanket. He must be important. Yes. She hesitated. Can I trust him? For the first time in days, something close to certainty flashed through Sandile's eyes. Yes, it should have comforted her. Instead, it made the next step real. Lorato drew the folded scrap from her apron pocket, the contact details she had copied quickly before returning the file exactly as she found it. I wrote down the number. Sandile kept looking at her, and in that gaze lay everything he still could not command. A loud urgency, dependence, dignity, fighting to survive helplessness. A maid from Katlehong now held in cheap pen on a torn piece of paper a possible barrier between a billionaire and the theft of his empire. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it were not so dangerous. I can't call from the house phone, she whispered, thinking aloud now, and not from anywhere obvious. Sandile's eyes did not waver. Lorato thought of her mother's rent, Saifo's tuition, the precarious dignity of surviving on wages earned in a rich house that could eject her without warning. She thought of Nokuthula's calm voice and Vuyo's polished greed. She thought of what happened to people with less power when they became inconvenient to those with more. Then she thought of her father on a hospital bed apologizing for becoming a burden. She unfolded her hand slowly and looked at the number again. I will find a way, she said. The words came out quiet, but once spoken they altered the room. Not because they solved anything, because they meant she had crossed another line past compassion, past witnessing into action. Sandile closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, the gratitude there was so stark it almost broke her. He was still weak, still trapped, still dependent on careful spoonfuls of soup and other people's hands to move him. But for the first time since the board began circling, he was no longer completely voiceless inside the fight. Lorato tucked the paper safely back into her pocket. Outside the door, footsteps passed in the hallway and moved on. Somewhere downstairs, Nokuthula's laughter floated up faintly from a phone call. The house remained elegant, controlled, and dangerous. Inside the room, the true battle had finally taken shape. It was no longer only about sickness or loneliness or even the cruelty of a failing marriage. It was about power, and Sandil's enemies had made one mistake they did not yet understand. In trying to reduce him to a helpless body, they had forgotten the value of the one person everyone else thought too small to matter. For 3 days, Lorato carried Themba Ndlovu's number in the hem of her apron like a live coal. She stitched it into the inner fold with 2 small, uneven threads, not because she was dramatic, but because poor women learn early that anything important left in an obvious place can be taken, discovered, or destroyed. Every time she changed uniforms, she moved the scrap carefully. Every time Nokuthula's gaze lingered on her a second too long, Lorato felt the hidden paper against her skin and had to force herself not to touch it. Finding a way to call was harder than deciding she would. The estate had cameras in all the obvious places. The landlines were monitored by household routine if not formally recorded. Staff moved in patterns that rich homes notice quickly when broken. Lorato could not simply disappear for half an hour without explanation, especially now that the house watched her with a sharpened interest. Nokuthula had not confronted her again directly since the dinner, but that silence did not feel like safety. It felt like calculation. Meanwhile, Sandile was deteriorating emotionally under the strain. Physically, there were signs of progress. His speech therapist coaxed more sounds from him. His left arm retained better coordination than before. He managed a few assisted standing exercises with brutal effort, face gray with strain, but jaw set stubbornly through it. Dr. Masalela called these encouraging developments, yet in every other way, Sandile seemed trapped in a different kind of collapse. He slept badly. He startled more easily. When Vuyo's voice appeared in the hallway, Sandile's whole body changed, shoulders tightening against the pillows, as though illness itself had learned to recognize threat. He ate less on the days Nokuthula held long, closed-door meetings. He watched documents like a starving man watches food. And whenever Lorato entered the room after being gone too long, the strain in his face eased so visibly that it made her want to weep. Dependence she had learned with her father could hollow a person from the inside long before it killed them. Nokuthula seemed to understand that too. She began tightening the circle around Sandile with the same elegant cruelty she applied to everything else. Ayanda was rotated in more often. The doctor's instructions were followed only when someone significant might notice. Certain papers stopped reaching Sandile's room altogether. Visits were filtered. He needs rest, Nokuthula would say, which in practice meant he needed silence, isolation, and less access to the world still moving around him. Then she turned to Lorato. The first blow came quietly. At breakfast briefing, Mazwan read out revised task assignments from a folded list handed down from management. Lorato was being moved off the main bedroom wing temporarily and reassigned to downstairs hospitality, support storage, inventory, and linen management for guest rooms. No mention was made of Sandile. No reason was given. Ayanda glanced up immediately. Lorato did not. She had learned to keep her face still before the rich, because shock often pleased them too much. "Yes, Mazwani," she said. The older woman shifted uncomfortably. "Orders from Madam." Of course. That day, Lorato's absence from Sandile's room lasted nearly 6 hours. She spent the morning in the laundry annex checking inventory she knew perfectly well did not need checking. Then in the downstairs guest corridor, changing sheets in rooms no one had used in weeks. Then polishing cabinet handles in the formal dining room, while one of the junior girls did the much simpler flower trimming that should have been her assignment. It was not labor meant to be completed. It was labor meant to keep her away. By midday, anxiety had become a physical ache behind her ribs. When she finally found an excuse to carry fresh towels upstairs, she encountered Ayanda outside Sandile's room, with a tray still half full. "He won't eat again," Ayanda whispered. "How long?" "Since morning." Lorato shut her eyes briefly. Inside, Sandile was awake, turned slightly toward the door. The untouched food sat beside him like evidence. His face had that drawn look she now recognized, not illness alone, but withdrawal. The doctor might have called it emotional discouragement. Lorato knew the simpler truth. He had realized she was being kept away. She moved to the bedside at once, forgetting for a moment that she was not supposed to be there. "I brought towels," she said quietly, because lies sometimes help preserve dignity better than truth. Sandile's eyes fixed on her, with a force that made the rest of the room disappear. She adjusted the blanket, lifted the glass, then picked up the spoon without asking. The first mouthful took effort. The second went down easier. By the fourth, his breathing had steadied. From the doorway came a slow clap. Lorato turned so sharply that water sloshed over the rim of the glass. Nokuthula stood there, not angry in the loud way. Worse, amused. "How touching," she said. Ayanda behind her looked like she wanted the floor to split open and swallow her whole. Lorato set the spoon down carefully. "Madam, I gave a very simple instruction this morning." Nokuthula stepped into the room, perfume arriving ahead of her like a declaration of territory. "You were reassigned. I only came to drop the towels, and somehow found yourself feeding my husband again." Lorato felt heat rise in her face. He had not eaten. Nokuthula smiled. "He has aides. He has staff. He has doctors." Her gaze shifted to the half-empty bowl. Then to Sandile. For a moment her expression hardened into something raw and ugly. "This is becoming ridiculous." Sandile made a low sound in his throat, part effort, part warning. Nokuthula ignored him. She turned back to Lorato. "Leave the room." Lorato did not move at once, not out of defiance, out of instinct. Sandile's eyes were on her, and in them was the old panic, the one that came when he knew he was being handed back to hands without care. "Now," Nokuthula said softly. Lorato lowered her gaze. "Yes, madam." She left, but the sound that followed her into the corridor stayed in her bones all day. Sandile, trying with damaged speech and failing control to force words past the wreckage in his throat as the door closed between them. That evening, Nokuthula escalated. Vuyo arrived just after sunset. The household was told there would be no interruptions in the upper sitting room. Coffee and bottled water only. No food service required. Jabulani himself supervised access to the wing. From downstairs, Lorato watched the men pass through the hall with files under their arms and the relaxed confidence of those who believe power is already transferring into their hands. She knew then that waiting any longer to call Themba would be fatal. Not for Sandile's body, perhaps. For everything else. Her opportunity came unexpectedly near 9. One of the guest wing toilets overflowed after a plumbing fault, and Mzwane sent 3 staff in different directions at once. Ayanda to fetch cleaning solution. 1 junior girl to find maintenance. Lorato to check whether spare absorbent. Towels remained in the outside storage shed near the back. Service gate. The shed sat beyond the laundry yard, just far enough from the main house that the cameras were fewer and the sound of activity faded under the rustle of trees and distant road noise. It was the closest thing to privacy the estate offered. Lorato's hands shook as she reached the shed door. Inside smelled of bleach, damp concrete, and old cardboard. She found the towels immediately. Then she set them down. For one long second, fear froze her. If this call was seen, heard, traced, guessed, or simply later suspected, she could lose more than the job. Nokuthula was the kind of woman who did not just dismiss people. She discredited them. A rumor from a rich wife could travel farther than truth from a poor maid ever would. Lorato drew the small phone from her pocket, cheap old prepaid used mostly for family emergencies and carefully rationed airtime. Then she took the folded scrap from the apron hem and dialed. It rang twice. 3 times. A man answered in a cautious, tired voice. Nedlovu. Lorato nearly lost her words. She forced them out. "Sir, my name is Lorato Maseko. I work at Mr. Sandile Dlamini's house." Silence. Then sharper. What happened? The question told her everything she needed to know. This was a man already braced for bad news. "He is alive," she said quickly. "But they are trying to move company control. Madam Nokuthula and Vuyo Kumalo. There have been meetings. Documents. I found an old letter with your name." Another silence. Not empty this time. Calculating. "Can Mr. Dlamini speak a little?" "Not much." "Can he understand?" "Yes." The man exhaled slowly. "Listen carefully. Do not say any of this again over that phone. Not to anyone." "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. I have been blocked from seeing him twice in the past month," Themba said, his tone now stripped of all politeness. "I was told he was not fit for legal consultation. I suspected interference, but not the speed of it." Lorato's grip tightened on the phone. "What should I do?" "For now, nothing visible. Do not confront them. Do not remove documents unless there is no other choice. Can you get word to Mr. Dlamini that I'm coming tomorrow?" Fear surged through her. If Madam refuses, she may try. Let her. A pause. There are legal boundaries she has already crossed if she blocked direct counsel while questions of capacity are being manipulated. "I will handle that," Rainwater dripped somewhere outside the shed from an earlier leak, each drop absurdly loud in the silence. "Miss Maseko," he said then more quietly, "you've taken a serious risk." Lorato swallowed. "I know, and you may pay for it." That somehow steadied her more than reassurance would have. Honesty felt safer. "Yes, sir." Another pause. "Then thank you." The line clicked dead. Lorato stood motionless for a moment, phone still pressed to her ear, though the call had ended. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought she might be sick. Nothing in the shed had changed. Towels still lay in a stack. Bleach still stung the air. But the world had shifted anyway. There was now an outside witness. A real one. A man with standing law, memory, and access to a world Nokuthula did not fully control. Lorato snatched up the towels and hurried back toward the house, forcing herself to walk, not run, once she neared the service corridor. Panic invites attention. Attention kills plans. She had almost reached the back hallway when she saw Jabulani. He was standing just inside the laundry entrance, arms folded. "Where were you?" The towels nearly slipped from her hands. "Storage shed. For the guest wing spill." Jabulani's eyes rested on her face a second too long. "You took time." The padlock stuck. He held her gaze, then stepped aside. "Madam is looking for you." Of course she was. Lorato carried the towels to the guest corridor, where the flood had already been half-managed by the others. Mazwan took one look at her and frowned. "Go upstairs," the older woman murmured. "Now." When Lorato reached the upper hall, Nokuthula was waiting outside Sandile's room. No raised voice, no witnesses close enough to interfere, only a stillness that felt colder than shouting ever could. "You are becoming a problem," Nokuthula said. Lorato lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry if stop saying sorry like a prayer." Nokuthula stepped closer. "I have tolerated enough." She held up a small packet between two fingers. Lorato frowned before understanding. Sandile's afternoon medication sachets. "One is missing," Nokuthula said. The lie was so sudden, so precise that for a moment Lorato could only stare. "I did not take anything." Nokuthula smiled faintly. "Perhaps not. But perhaps a confused maid moved things where she should not have. I didn't. And perhaps," Nokuthula continued, "that same maid has been handling papers, hovering in rooms, encouraging dependency and forgetting her place." Lorato felt the corridor tilt around her. This was not warning anymore. This was construction. A case. An excuse. Nokuthula's voice dropped to almost nothing. "Pack your things tonight. Jabulani will pay what is owed. If I decide not to involve the police, you should count that as mercy." Inside Sandile's room, something struck the bedrail hard. A raw, broken sound followed rage forced through damaged speech. Nokuthula did not turn. Lorato stood frozen, not from innocence, but from the brutality of how quickly a rich person can rearrange reality when they need a poor woman gone. Then Sandile made the sound again. Louder, fighting the limits of his own body to be heard. And in that moment, even with shame burning through her and panic rising like floodwater in her chest, Lorato understood one thing with absolute clarity. Nokuthula was not removing her because of gossip. She was removing her because Sandile was beginning to come back. Lorato packed in less than 20 minutes. That, more than anything else, revealed the truth of her life inside the Dlamini estate. For nearly a year, she had moved through hallways lined with imported art, polished silver soft carpets, and rooms large enough to swallow the homes of whole families like hers. She had cleaned luxury without belonging to it. She had folded linen she could never afford, carried dishes she would never taste from, and opened curtains each morning on a world that looked stable only because people like her kept it that way. Yet when the time came to leave, all she truly owned fit into one faded canvas bag. 2 uniforms, 1 church dress, 1 extra pair of shoes with a cracked sole, a headscarf, a Bible with loose pages, a tin of skin cream, a family photograph curled at the edges, her phone charger, a packet of pain tablets, the small amount of cash she had hidden in a sock, and the phone itself, the cheap one that had less than an hour earlier carried a message that might change the fate of a billionaire. Everything else in that house had only ever passed through her hands. Jabulani stood outside the small staff room while she packed, pretending distance, but not enough to be called kind. He was a broad man with tired eyes and the posture of someone who had long ago accepted that his livelihood depended on standing close to injustice without ever calling it by name. He did not accuse her directly. He did not insult her. He only repeated what had been decided. "Madam says the accounting will be done tomorrow," he said. "You can collect final wages through the office." Lerato folded her second uniform carefully. "I have done nothing wrong." Jabulani exhaled through his nose, not impatient, not sympathetic, just weary. Right and wrong are not what decides these things. She paused, then one hand resting on the bag. The sentence landed harder because it was true. In another mood, she might have resented him for saying it. Instead, she only felt the cold clarity of it settle inside her bones. No witness from the staff wing would save her. No one here was powerful enough to stand against Nokuthula and remain untouched. "Did she tell the police I stole medication?" Lerato asked. "Not yet. Not yet." The phrase made the room feel smaller. Jabulani kept his eyes on the half-open doorway. "Go quietly, Lerato. That is the only advice I have." It was bad advice for justice. It was excellent advice for survival. Lerato slung the bag over her shoulder and stepped into the corridor. Ayanda stood near the laundry turn with tears already gathered in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "I'm sorry," the younger woman whispered. "For what? For all of it?" Lerato gave a tired shake of her head. "Look after yourself." Ayanda's lips trembled. "What about him?" Neither of them needed to say Sandile's name. Lerato looked toward the upper floor where the hallway lights glowed softly beyond the bend. Somewhere above them, in a room that smelled of medicine and polished wood and silenced dignity, Sandile was there, aware, angry, trapped, and likely hearing enough to understand what was happening. The urge to run upstairs one last time almost overpowered her. But that was exactly what Nokuthula wanted, one final visible violation, one more thing to use as proof that the maid could not respect boundaries. "I can't help him by giving her more against me," Lerato said at last, though saying it felt like swallowing broken glass. Ayanda nodded through tears. The walk from the staff wing to the front service entrance felt longer than it ever had before. Every light seemed too bright. Every polished surface reflected back a woman trying very hard not to let humiliation distort her spine. The marble floors she had scrubbed glimmered under warm, recessed lighting. Somewhere in the distance, a television murmured softly from Nokuthula's private lounge. A scent diffuser in the corridor released expensive citrus into the air, as if the house itself wished to remain fragrant while discarding people. At the final bend, Lerato stopped. Sandile's room was only one corridor away. She stood motionless, bag against her shoulder, heart beating so hard she thought it might betray her aloud. She could not go in. She knew that. Yet leaving without any acknowledgement felt unbearable. Almost against her will, she lifted her gaze toward the ceiling, toward the wing above. A faint sound came then. Not from the television. Not from downstairs. From upstairs. A thud against metal. Then another. Her breath caught. Sandile. She closed her eyes for 1 second and pressed her lips together so hard they hurt. He knew. He was trying to be heard. Trying perhaps to stop what could not now be stopped by volume or broken speech. When she opened her eyes again, Mazwan was standing near the side passage. The older woman's face, usually hard with efficiency, had softened into something close to sorrow. She came forward 2 slow steps and held out a folded parcel. "Bread," she said, "and 2 boiled eggs." Lerato stared at it. For the road. That was all. No speech about life, no dramatic consolation, no false promise that everything would be fine. Just food offered the way poor women have always comforted one another when dignity is being stripped in public or private. Lerato took it. "Thank you." Mazwane's gaze sharpened for a brief instant. "Listen to me carefully. Do not go back to your mother's house directly tonight." Lerato frowned. "Why? Because if Madam decides to make this uglier by morning, the first place they'll look is where you are known." The older woman lowered her voice further. "Stay with someone else. Move before sunrise." The warning was so precise that fear slid coldly down Lerato's spine. She would do that, Mazwan held her gaze. A woman protecting position will do more than a woman protecting pride. That answer was enough. Lerato nodded once, clutching the bread parcel and bag. Outside, the night was cool and dry, the earlier heat drained from the air. Security lights washed the side driveway in pale white. The city beyond the walls sounded far away. Traffic murmur, a barking dog, the distant bass of music from somewhere lower in the neighborhood. The gate buzzed open after Mfo checked Jabulani's instruction with visible reluctance. As Lerato passed him, Mfo spoke without fully facing her. "There was a man asking about the house yesterday afternoon." She stopped. "What man? Lawyer type? Older? Drove a gray sedan?" Jabulani told him Madam said no visitors. Memfo glanced at her briefly now. He looked angry. Themba. Hope rose so suddenly it felt painful. Did he give a name I didn't hear? But she did not need to. She knew. Thank you, she said. Memfo gave the smallest nod and looked away again. Once beyond the gate, Lerato did not head toward the taxi rank she normally used when returning to Katlahong. Mazwan's warning echoed too loudly in her mind. Instead, she walked 2 streets over before flagging a minibus going in the opposite direction toward an older district where her church friend Nomsa rented 1 room behind a mechanic's shop. The taxi ride blurred. Neon signs. Dark shop fronts. Men laughing outside a tavern. A child asleep against a woman's shoulder. The conductor shouting stops in a tired rhythm. Lerato sat pressed against the window with her bag on her lap and the parcel of bread untouched. For the first time since Nokuthula accused her, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had lost the job, possibly lost the reference she would need for the next one, possibly gained an accusation that could be turned into police trouble if Nokuthula wished, possibly put danger on her family simply by refusing to act blind, and still beneath the fear one stubborn thread remained. Themba knew. The thought did not fix anything. It did not bring back wages or remove risk, but it meant the truth had stepped outside the walls of the Dlamini estate. The secret no longer belonged only to those inside it. Namsa opened the door in a wrapper, and old t-shirt confusion turning immediately to concern when she saw Lerato's face. What happened? I was dismissed. Namsa stepped aside without another question. Come in first. The room was small but warm. 1 bed, a thin mattress on the floor, a kettle, 2 enamel mugs, a plastic basin tucked under a chair. Real poverty does not ask for explanations before making room. Lerato sat. Only when Namsa handed her tea did the first tear finally fall. Not loud sobbing, not collapse, just 1 tear then another from the exhaustion of holding herself upright for too long. Namsa waited. Lerato told her most of it, though not every legal detail and not Themba's number. Enough for the outline, the illness, the cruelty, the storm, the accusation, the dismissal. Enough to make another woman understand the shape of the danger. Namsa listened without interruption. When the story ended, she asked only 1 question. Did you do what they say? No. Namsa nodded. Then don't let their version become your memory. The sentence settled deep, because that was the real violence of rich people's lies, not only that they could harm your future, but that they could begin trying to rewrite your understanding of your own past, make you feel guilty for compassion, reckless for decency, suspicious for noticing what everyone else had normalized. Later, long after Nomsa slept, Lerato remained awake on the mattress near the wall, staring into darkness. She thought of Sandili in that room, likely unable to rest, likely turning the whole house over in his mind, with the fury of a man who once controlled outcomes and now could not prevent the expulsion of the one ally he trusted. She thought of Themba driving to the estate, perhaps already reaching the gate by morning. She thought of Nokuthula serene in her victory, assuming she had finally removed the inconvenient witness. Just before dawn, Lerato's phone vibrated in her hand. Unknown number. Her throat tightened as she answered softly, "Hello." A man's voice came through, low and controlled. "Miss Maseko, this is Themba Ndlovu." Lerato sat up instantly. "I went to the house at 6:30, he said. "They refused me again, but they made 1 mistake." Her fingers closed around the phone. "What mistake?" "They told me you had been dismissed for theft." A pause. "Which means they know exactly why I came." Lerato's pulse thundered. Themba's voice hardened, each word precise. "I'm taking this further now. I need you to stay reachable, and if I ask you to testify to what you've seen, will you stand by it?" Fear and certainty collided so sharply inside her that for 1 second she could not speak. Then she remembered Sandile's eyes when she told him, "You are not alone." She remembered the storm. She remembered the first broken shape of her own name in his mouth. "Yes," she said. Themba was silent for half a breath, as if measuring not her courage but the cost of it. "Good," he replied, "because from this point onward they are no longer just dealing with a maid they can throw out. They are dealing with witnesses." The line ended. Morning light was beginning to gather thinly at the edge of the curtain. Lerato lowered the phone slowly, her heart still racing. She was afraid. She was jobless. She had nowhere stable to stand. But for the first time since walking out of the Dlamini gate, she understood that leaving the house had not removed her from the battle. It had only changed the ground on which it would now be fought. By the time the sun rose fully over Johannesburg, the shape of Lorato's life had changed so completely that the previous week already felt like a story told about somebody else. Yesterday, she had still belonged, however conditionally, inside the Dlamini estate. Today, she was a dismissed maid sleeping on a borrowed mattress in a one-room outbuilding behind a mechanic's shop, holding a phone that now connected her to lawyers' danger and a truth bigger than anything she had ever expected to carry. Nomsa left early for work at a garment stall near the taxi rank, pressing bread and tea into Lorato's hands before going. "Stay inside for a while," she said. "And don't open for anyone you don't know." Lorato nodded. The room fell silent after the door closed. Morning light came through the thin curtain in narrow bands, revealing suspended dust, a cracked basin, a kettle with a dented lid, the ordinary poverty of women surviving without drama because drama required energy they did not have. Lorato sat on the edge of the mattress, knees drawn up slightly, and let the stillness settle around her. She should have been thinking first about money, her final wages, her mother's medication, Sipho's fees. The next job if any employer would take a woman dismissed from a wealthy house under accusation. But her mind stayed fixed on Sandile. Not romantically, not foolishly, only with the painful, insistent awareness that he was still in that room, still surrounded by people trying to isolate him, still fighting through damage and humiliation while the walls around him closed tighter. At 9:30, Themba Ndlovu called again. His voice, unlike the night before, carried no hesitation now. He sounded like a man who had stepped fully into battle. "I need to see you," he said. "Can you come to my office?" Lorato hesitated only because of transport money. As if reading the silence, he added, "I'll send a driver. He'll call you when he arrives. Do not tell anyone where you're going." An hour later, a gray sedan stopped 2 streets away from Nomsa's place, not directly outside. That detail alone told Lorato how serious the situation had become. Themba was not careless. He was already thinking like a man who assumed eyes might be watching. The driver, a middle-aged woman named Ruth, spoke little beyond confirming her name. They drove not to the glossy tower blocks of Sandile's company district, but to an older legal building in Rosebank, respectable, discreet, with no enormous branding on the front. Inside, the air smelled of paper coffee, furniture polish, and controlled urgency. Themba Ndlovu was older than Lorato expected, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver at his temples, tired but sharp eyes, and the bearing of a man who had spent decades entering rooms where people lied politely for a living. He did not waste time on ceremony. He stood when she entered, shook her hand once firmly, and gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Start from the beginning," he said. So she did. Not every memory in dramatic order. Not like a storyteller. Like a witness. She told him about Sandile's illness, Nokuthula's coldness, the staff cuts, the delayed care, the storm, the failed machine, the board meetings, the document she had seen, Vuyo's visits, the old legal letter in the library, the call she made from the storage shed, the accusation, the dismissal. Themba interrupted only to pin down dates, names, exact phrases, who else might have heard something, which doctor was present on which occasion, and whether Sandile had ever communicated specific intent about documents or counsel. When she finished, he leaned back slowly. "Worse than I feared," he said. Lorato's throat tightened. "Can they really take everything from him while he's like this?" Themba folded his hands. "Not legally, if I can establish that he understands enough to instruct object or recognize what is happening. The problem is that people like Nokuthula and Vuyo don't begin with legality. They begin with control. By the time the law arrives, they hope control has already hardened into fact." The words sent a chill through her. He slid a notepad closer and wrote several names. Dr. Masalela, the speech therapist, any aides who were present during the improvements. "We need people who can verify Sandile's responsiveness. We also need evidence that access to me was intentionally blocked." Lorato glanced down. "Will they listen to me? Do not say just anything in this office." Themba cut in, not unkindly. "You are the first person who acted when others chose comfort. That matters." The simple force of the sentence almost undid her. No one in positions like his ever spoke to women like her that way. He went on, "The accusation against you is not random. It was designed to discredit you before you could become useful. Which tells me Nokuthula understood the danger you posed before you fully understood it yourself." Lorato sat very still. Then she asked the question that had been quietly burning beneath all the others. "What happens to Sandile now?" Themba's expression changed. Not softened exactly, but deepened. "If I can get direct access, I'll need him to do 3 things. Recognize me, respond consistently, Indicate in whatever way possible that he objects to interim transfer and wants independent review. And if Madam blocks you again. A thin, humorless smile touched his mouth. Then she gives me more to use. By noon, Lorato had signed a written statement. Themba's assistant took down the details carefully, read them back to her, corrected 2 dates, and printed the final version for signature. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote her name, not because she doubted the truth, but because writing it in legal form made everything heavier, realer. No longer only memory and private outrage. When the meeting ended, Themba did something unexpected. He took her down the hall to a rehabilitation unit on the ground floor of a medical consultancy linked to the building. It was not luxurious, but it was clean, professional, calm. A physiotherapist, a speech specialist, and a nurse moved through the space with the focused gentleness of people used to slow recovery. I arranged an informal consultation, Themba said. For you. Lorato blinked. For me, you've already been doing parts of supportive care instinctively. The way you describe feeding, repositioning, calming him during distress you learn through necessity. I need you to understand the formal side as well. A woman in her 40s named Sister Naledi greeted her warmly and spent nearly an hour showing her correct supportive techniques, safer assisted feeding angles, warning signs of swallowing fatigue, ways to reduce panic in Sister, speech frustrated patients, basic documentation habits, and how to observe, without crossing into medical practice. It was not a full training, not anything certified in the formal sense, but it was far more than Lorato had ever imagined receiving. As Naledi demonstrated how to position a patient's shoulder to reduce strain, Lorato felt a strange ache spread through her chest. For months, she had been doing whatever she could with memory, instinct, and grief. Nobody had ever stopped to say, "Here, let us teach you properly." When the session ended, Naledi handed her a few photocopied pages of notes. "You have good instincts," she said. "But instinct needs structure if you don't want it to break you." On the drive back, Johannesburg looked different through the car window. Still crowded, still unequal, still full of money gleaming beside hardship, as if the two had signed some ugly permanent truce. But now the city also held offices, witnesses, records, and people who spoke a language of power she did not know yet, but could perhaps stand near without being erased. That evening, Themba called again. "I got in," he said. Lorato stood so quickly from Namsa's chair that it scraped the floor. "You saw him, yes." Her heart slammed once against her ribs. "How is he?" A pause. Angry, exhausted, fully aware. Lorato pressed her free hand over her mouth. Themba continued. Nokuthula tried to claim he was too fragile for legal consultation. I informed her in front of Dr. Masalela and 2 staff witnesses that continued obstruction would raise immediate concerns of coercive isolation. She stepped aside. For the first time in days, Lorato felt something like air return to her lungs. "He recognized you at once. More importantly, he recognized Vuyo's name, Nokuthula's role, and my explanation of the interim proposal. His speech is damaged, but his comprehension is absolutely not gone." Themba's tone turned colder. "Which means anyone pushing incapacity without independent review is skating on very dangerous ground." Lorato sat slowly back down. "And there's more," he said. "I requested an external rehabilitation and cognitive reassessment team. Not through the house. Through private medical channels, Nokuthula cannot curate as easily." She closed her eyes briefly. For days, she had been holding herself against a cliff edge. Now, at last, some other hands were on the rope. But Themba was not finished. "I also told him," he said more quietly, "now that you called me." Lorato opened her eyes. A silence followed. Then he cried. The room around her disappeared for a second. Not because she imagined herself important in some grand way, but because the image was too much. Sandile proud, even in ruin, a man shaped by command and discipline, crying simply because someone he had no power to reward had not abandoned him after being thrown out. Lorato lowered her gaze to the floor. "I didn't want him to think I left by choice," she said. "He does not." Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. Themba let the silence hold for a moment, then said, "He wants you back." Lorato froze. Back. The word itself felt impossible. She swallowed. "As what that Themba said is where things become complicated," he explained slowly. He could not legally force the household to rehire her as domestic staff. Nokuthula would never agree to that anyway. But if the independent medical team recommended a structured, trusted support presence during parts of Sandile's recovery, and if Sandile himself indicated clearly that he wanted Lorato present as part of his rehabilitative environment, then there were roots. Not as a maid, not under Nokuthula's private household authority, under protected medical and legal observation. Lorato listened in stunned silence. You mean, as a caregiver? As a trusted recovery aid, yes. Supported, documented, and much harder to remove without consequence. Her first feeling was not triumph. It was fear. Nokuthula will hate that. Themba's voice remained dry. Miss Maseko, I think we're already well beyond the stage of worrying whether Nokuthula likes an arrangement. Despite everything, a shaky breath that was almost a laugh escaped Lorato. Then the fear returned larger and more honest. What if people say I'm using this to climb? They already say what suits them, he replied. The question is whether truth will have structure this time. After the call ended, Lorato sat in the dim one-room space long after the sky darkened. Namsa returned, cooked May's meal, asked a few questions, and wisely did not press when Lorato answered only some of them. Outside, a radio played from the neighboring yard, then went silent. Somewhere in the lane, a child cried, was hushed and slept. Lorato unfolded Sister Naletti's notes and read them again by weak lamplight. Positioning, observation, patience, documentation, dignity. Each word felt larger than itself. If she returned, nothing would be simple. Nokuthula's contempt would deepen, gossip would sharpen. Every step would be watched, interpreted, twisted if possible. She would be walking not back into a job, but into a battlefield disguised as a recovery plan. And yet when she imagined Sandile hearing that she would not come, something inside her recoiled. Not because he was wealthy, not because he might one day reward her, but because abandonment had already done enough damage in that room. Near midnight, her phone lit up with one final message from Themba Medical Review tomorrow. Stay ready. Lorato looked at the words for a long time. Then she set the phone down and whispered into the quiet room to no one and perhaps to God, let me stand where truth can still breathe. Outside, Johannesburg kept moving through its restless night. Inside, the poor maid the house had tried to discard was no longer standing only at the edge of someone else's story. She was walking back toward it this time, not as invisible labor, but as a name Sandile himself had chosen, and as a presence that power had failed to erase. The invitation arrived wrapped in gold. It was delivered to the Dlamini estate, to 2 board members, to politicians, charity patrons, investors, pastors, business reporters, society wives, and the sort of people who never miss an event where grief can be observed from a safe distance, while champagne remains cold. On the card, the evening was described as a foundation renewal gala, a celebration of resilience, charity, and the future of the Sandile Dlamini Legacy Initiative. The cruelty of the title was so perfect it almost felt theatrical. Sandile had not approved the event. The legacy being celebrated was one he had not been allowed to shape, and the woman organizing it intended to use his weakened body, his partial recovery, and the public's sympathy as scenery for a different purpose entirely. By the time Themba learned of the gala, the invitations had already circulated. By the time Lorato heard about it, Nokuthula's plan had already begun. This is not a charity event, Themba said from across his office desk, jaw tight with controlled anger. It's a staging ground. Lorato sat opposite him, hands clasped so tightly in her lap they ached. She had returned twice now to the Dlamini estate under the shield of medical review and legal oversight. Not fully, not freely, and never alone, but enough to know that Nokuthula's outward calm had become more dangerous, not less. She smiled more now, spoke more softly, allowed people to think she had accepted the new structure. That was precisely what frightened Lorato. How, Lorato asked. Themba slid a copy of the invitation toward her. She wants witnesses, the right kind, public ones. If Sandile appears fragile, confused, emotionally erratic, she gains sympathy and narrative control. If she can make you look opportunistic in the same room, even better. Lorato stared at the heavy cream card. You think she'll use me there? Themba met her gaze. I think she's been waiting for a stage large enough. Over the previous week, the independent medical review had already shifted the ground beneath Nokuthula's feet. 2 outside specialists had evaluated Sandile privately and concluded that although his speech and motor control remained impaired, his comprehension, memory, and decision-making capacity were significantly stronger than the household had represented. Dr. Masalela, forced now into greater honesty by the presence of external oversight, had supported the findings. Themba had frozen the most aggressive interim transfer proposals. Vuyo, though still moving around the company, had become more careful in public. But Nokuthula was not defeated. She was adapting. and Nokuthula adapted best when rich people were watching. The evening of the gala arrived hot and windless. Johannesburg lay under a velvet darkness broken by streetlights, headlights, and the glitter of expensive buildings pretending the city did not ache beneath them. The event was held not at the company headquarters but at the Dlamini Foundation Hall, an elegant private venue attached to one of the family's charitable arms, full of polished stone, high ceilings, chandeliers, and too much gold for true dignity. It was beautiful in the way power often is when it wants to be photographed. Lorato had not wanted to come. Not because she was afraid of being seen, though she was. Not because she feared the whispers, though she knew they would come. But because there was something unbearable about stepping into a room full of people dressed for benevolence, while knowing how much private cruelty had financed the lighting. Still, Themba insisted. Sandile asked for you to be present, he said that afternoon. And this time he asked clearly enough that nobody can pretend otherwise. The sentence had silenced her. So she came. Not in a maid's uniform. Not in borrowed glamour either. Namza had helped her choose a simple navy dress, modest, clean, elegant in a quiet way. Ruth drove her. Themba met her at a side entrance rather than the front where camera flashes were already exploding against the arriving guests. Before they entered, he paused and turned to her. Whatever happens in there, stay beside truth. Do not defend yourself too much. People who want scandal feed on desperation. Lorato nodded, though her throat felt tight. Inside the room shimmered with polished performance. Men in black suits and women in jewel-toned gowns moved beneath chandelier light as waiters circulated with trays of sparkling water and wine. A string quartet played near the far wall. Large screens displayed photographs from the foundation's past. Charitable work, school donations, clinic openings, scholarship programs, smiling children, Sandile, cutting ribbons when he had still stood strong and broad-shouldered at podiums without assistance. Now he was seated near the front of the hall. The room had been arranged to frame him carefully close enough to be seen, elevated enough to command sympathy, surrounded by strategic softness, flowers, tasteful branding, a discreet medical chair hidden by design. He wore a dark suit tailored to his thinner frame. Recovery had returned some structure to him, but not enough to disguise what illness had taken. His left hand rested on the armrest. His face was composed, but anyone who knew him well would have seen the fury beneath that stillness. Lorato did. The moment his eyes found her across the room, something shifted in his expression. Not weakness, not pleading, recognition, relief, and a kind of hard-held steadiness. Nokuthula saw it too. She was radiant in ivory silk, every detail of her appearance, chosen for effect, restrained grief transformed into social grace. When she moved through the hall, greeting guests, touching wrists lightly, smiling with measured sorrow, she looked like the image of devotion surviving hardship. Lorato understood then that this was Nokuthula's true arena, not sick rooms, not medical decisions, narrative, and tonight she intended to own it. The program began with speeches. A pastor spoke first of perseverance. A board member spoke of legacy and continuity. An investment partner spoke of resilience in leadership. Everything was carefully worded. Nobody said Sandile was incapable. Nobody said Nokuthula was assuming more control. But the implication hovered like perfume in the air. The old era was fading, and gracious people were helping transition the future. Then Nokuthula stepped to the podium. The room softened for her immediately. That was the terrible advantage beautiful liars often possess. People lean closer before they have any reason to distrust. She stood under the lights, one hand resting lightly on the podium, and let silence gather before speaking. These past months, she said gently, have taught me what love really costs. A murmur of sympathy moved through the room. Lorato felt sick. Nokuthula continued with practiced restraint, speaking of long nights, uncertainty, prayer, burden, courage, and the strange loneliness of standing beside a man the world once knew only as strong. She never lied in a way a lawyer could easily pin down. She lied through omission, arrangement, emphasis, through tone. Then with exquisite timing she shifted. And in seasons like this, she said, lowering her voice just enough to invite intimacy, families must also protect the vulnerable from confusion. Themba, beside Lorato, went very still. Nokuthula turned slightly, not enough to point, but enough for her gaze to drift toward Sandile. When powerful men are weakened, they often become dependent on whoever is closest in moments of fear. We must treat that with compassion, not exploitation. The sentence fell into the room like oil. No names. No accusation that could be challenged directly. but every person with ears and appetite for scandal understood exactly what she had planted. A few heads turned. Toward Sandile. Toward Lorato. Toward the empty space between them where gossip could now do its work. Lorato's face burned, but she did not move. Themba's jaw tightened visibly. "Don't react," he murmured. On stage, Nokuthula's voice remained warm. Illness changes dynamics. It blurs lines. It can cause attachments that feel meaningful in crisis but are not always rooted in clarity. That did it. Across the room, Sandile's hand struck the armrest, not loudly enough to stop the hall but hard enough that several people near the front turned. His breathing had changed. Lorato could see it even from where she stood. Nokuthula saw too, and pressed on. So in honoring dignity, she said, "We must also protect my husband from those who—" Enough. The word came rough, broken, and yet so unmistakably full of command that the room seemed to lose air. Every head turned. Sandile was pushing himself up. Not fully alone, one support hand from the rehabilitation aide nearby steadied his elbow, but the force of the movement was his. The hall froze. The quartet had already stopped. Glasses lowered. Reporters leaned forward. The sound system hummed faintly in the silence. Nokuthula stared at him, real shock, finally cracking her polished face. Sandile stood. Not steadily. Not beautifully. One leg still lagged slightly. His shoulders were uneven with effort. But he stood. And in that moment, he looked more powerful than half the healthy men in the room. The microphone at the podium picked up Nokuthula's sharp intake of breath. Sandile's eyes were not on her. They were on Lorato. He drew in a difficult breath jaw, working against the stubborn wreckage of damaged speech. The room waited with the cruel fascination people reserve for public vulnerability. He tried once, failed, tried again. "Not," he said, voice raw. The word hung there. Themba moved one step forward, but Sandile gave the faintest shake of his head. "No. Let me." "Not." Confusion. The room seemed to tilt. Lorato felt tears sting instantly, but she held them back. Sandile turned, then slowly, visibly, deliberately, toward the guests, the board, the cameras, the donors, the people who had come dressed to observe controlled tragedy. He lifted his trembling left hand and pointed not at Lorato but at Nokuthula. Then, with brutal effort, he formed another phrase. She stayed. A murmur rippled through the hall. Nokuthula stepped away from the podium, smile gone now. "Sandile, please, you shouldn't strain yourself." He cut across her with more force than clarity, but enough. "You left." The silence that followed was no longer sympathetic. It was shocked. Real shocked. Not the theatrical kind. The kind that comes when a script tears open in public. Lorato could see the board members exchanging looks. One of the reporters had already lifted a phone. The pastor seemed to have forgotten to breathe. Vujo near the side, Isla had gone rigid. Nokuthula recovered fast, as women like her often do. "This is exactly what I meant," she said, turning back toward the room with pain painted across her features. "He is emotional. He has been influenced, no." This time the word burst from Sandile, with such force that everyone heard it, though it clearly cost him. The rehabilitation aide reached nearer, but Sandile held himself upright with stubborn fury. He turned again, and now his gaze found Lorato fully. Then he spoke not as a broken man, grasping for random sound, but as someone pulling truth through fire. "She saved me." A woman near the back gasped. Lorato felt the room's attention slam into her from all sides. Sandile drew another breath, shoulders shaking with effort. "When she gone." He swallowed. Tried again. "They take everything." That was enough. More than enough. Because the hall no longer heard only marital pain. They heard implication. Manipulation. Control. Money. Themba moved, then finally stepping forward with the calm of a man who had been waiting for the right fracture point. "I think," he said clearly into the stunned room, given Mr. Dlamini's stated objection and his demonstrated lucidity, any further discussion of governance tonight should be suspended. He did not shout. He did not need to. The authority in his voice cut cleanly through the spectacle. Nokuthula turned toward him with something close to hatred. But the room had shifted too far now. People were no longer watching her. They were watching Sandile. Watching Lorato. Watching truth, incomplete but undeniable, bleed through the silk wrapping of a carefully planned lie. And for the first time since illness entered the Dlamini house, Nokutula could no longer fully control what the witnesses had seen. The gala did not end with applause. It ended with collapse, not the physical kind, though Sandile nearly gave his body more than it could safely carry that night. It was the collapse of control, of polished narrative, of the careful illusion Nokuthula had spent months building around his silence. Once Themba spoke, the room broke into fragments. Not chaos. Wealthy people are too disciplined for visible chaos. But clusters formed immediately. Conversations sharpened. Board members drifted together with tight mouths and lowered voices. Two reporters moved discreetly toward the side aisle, phones already active. One of Nokuthula's charity friends stood frozen beside a floral arrangement, still holding a wine glass she no longer remembered drinking from. Vuyo disappeared from the main floor for several minutes, likely to make calls. Even the waitstaff moved differently now, still silent, still professional, but with the unmistakable alertness of people who know they are watching the exact moment a private lie becomes public trouble. Sandile had to sit. His knees gave warning before his pride did, and the rehabilitation aide, together with Dr. Masalela, who had attended the gala in a professional capacity, guided him back into the chair with enough discretion to preserve what dignity the moment still allowed. But the damage from Nokuthula's perspective had already been done. Sandile had spoken. He had contradicted her in public. He had named abandonment without hiding it behind polished language. Most dangerous of all, he had done it before witnesses whose status could not be casually erased. Lerato remained where she was for a few seconds longer, unable to move. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear blood in her ears. The room around her looked strangely bright, each chandelier light too sharp, each face too visible. She had spent much of her life avoiding attention because attention rarely brought safety to women like her. Now it had found her fully, and there was nowhere left to hide. Themba crossed to her side first. "Stay close," he murmured. That was all. Not comfort. Instruction. From the stage area, Nokuthula recovered faster than anyone else. Lerato watched the transformation happen in real time. The shock receded. The pain rearranged itself on her face into something sadder, nobler, more dangerous. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nokuthula said, stepping back toward the microphone, her voice unsteady in exactly the way people trusted. "I think tonight has shown how fragile this season has been for all of us." The sentence was expertly chosen. She did not deny what Sandile said. She reframed it. "Our family is under strain," she continued. "My husband is still recovering, and recovery can surface anger, confusion, memory distortion." "No," Themba said sharply from below the stage. This time, the interruption carried legal force, not emotional force. He stepped fully into view, straightened his jacket, and addressed the room with the controlled clarity of a man who knew every sentence might matter later. "Mr. Dlamini has undergone independent assessment within the last week. His cognition is not absent, and any attempt to characterize his statements tonight as mere confusion would be profoundly misleading." That changed the air again. The word independent landed hard. Several heads turned immediately, not to Nokuthula, but to the board members. One of them, a gray-haired man named Mbele, frowned deeply and exchanged a look with the woman beside him. They had likely not been told about any independent assessment. Or worse, they had been told something different. Nokuthula smiled tightly. "With respect, Themba, this is neither the place nor the time to litigate my husband's private health." Then perhaps Themba replied it should not have been the place to stage-manage his incapacity. A low, involuntary sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp. Not quite a murmur. Something in between the sound people make when class manners fail for 1 second. Vuyo reappeared at the edge of the hall and immediately stopped taking in the altered mood. His face remained composed, but his eyes had hardened. Lerato saw him look at her only once. It was enough. Not desire, not contempt. Calculation. She knew that look. It was the look of people deciding how to minimize damage now that easy options had closed. The official program never resumed. Instead, guests began drifting towards smaller conversations, each one pretending not to be about the scandal while being entirely about it. A board member approached Dr. Masalela. 2 donors quietly left without saying goodbye. The reporter near the back pretended to check messages while clearly recording audio notes. Nokuthula's charity friends closed around her in a loose, protective shape, but none seemed quite certain which version of the night they were now meant to believe. And Sandile, though seated again, remained upright, eyes open, face pale with strain but alive with something Lerato had not seen so clearly before. Authority. Injured. Interrupted. fighting its way back through broken speech and weakened muscle. But there, when Dr. Masalela finally advised immediate rest and removal from the crowd, Nokuthula attempted to step forward as if naturally entitled to guide her husband away. Sandile's left hand lifted not high, not smoothly, but unmistakably, and stopped her. Then he turned his gaze toward Lerato. No words this time. None were needed. Themba noticed too. He goes with the rehab team, he said before Nokuthula could speak, and Miss Maseko will accompany them as part of the documented support plan. Nokuthula's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. Absolutely not. It is already documented, Themba said. That was not entirely true yet, but it was close enough and spoken firmly enough that no one challenged him immediately, especially not with witnesses still standing nearby. So Sandile was taken through a private side passage not by his wife but by the rehabilitation aide doctor, Masalela, Lerato, and Themba. The movement itself felt symbolic, small, practical, devastating. Behind them, the gala's gold-lit fantasy kept unraveling. The private recovery room attached to the foundation hall was quiet, cooler, less suffocating than the ballroom. Once the door closed, Sandile sagged with visible exhaustion. Dr. Masalela checked his pressure pulse, pupils breathing. The rehabilitation aide adjusted his support position. Themba stepped aside to make 2 calls in quick succession, his voice low and clipped. Lerato stood near the side table, hands clasped, trying not to cry from pure nervous release. Sandile opened his eyes and found her at once. The look in them made her throat tighten. Not triumph, not romance. Relief mixed with fierce apology, as if he hated that she had been dragged publicly into this war and yet had needed the truth exposed exactly that way. You should not speak more tonight, Doctor. Masalela warned him gently. Sandile ignored him the way powerful men often ignore good advice once they have chosen a direction. He looked at Themba, then at Lerato, then, slowly with effort, formed a broken phrase. Board. Tomorrow. Themba stepped closer. Yes, we're moving it forward. Sandile blinked once. Agreement. Resolve. That night did not end in rest. It ended in preparation. By 10 the next morning, an emergency board meeting had been convened at company headquarters under legal pressure from Themba and at least 2 rattled board members who no longer wished to be associated with anything that might later resemble coercive governance. Independent medical summaries were requested formally. Dr. Masalela was instructed to attend. So was the external assessment team. Vuyo arrived early. Nokuthula arrived later, dressed in dark green, composed, cold, and visibly determined to hold what ground she could. Lerato did not belong in rooms like that. The headquarters tower itself seemed built to remind people of exactly that. Glass walls, brushed steel, expensive, quiet reception, staff trained never to show surprise, art selected to imply seriousness rather than joy. Lerato entered through a side elevator with Themba and one of his assistants wearing the same navy dress from the night before under a modest blazer borrowed from Namsa. She felt every eye that turned toward her in the lobby. Let them look, she told herself. The boardroom was long and cool, lined with windows overlooking the city. Sandile was brought in with support and seated at the head end, not because he was physically strongest, but because the symbolism mattered. His presence at that end of the table altered the geometry of power immediately. Nokuthula sat 3 seats away, not beside him. That too mattered. Themba opened with documentation, dates of blocked access, evidence of external cognitive assessment, procedural concerns around interim transfer efforts. Questions regarding the role of Vuyo Kumalo in governance discussions before legal thresholds had been met. Nothing dramatic in tone, everything devastating in substance. Vuyo attempted first to sound calm. This is being exaggerated. We were only exploring continuity options in the company's best interest, without disclosing independent restrictions already in place in Mr. Dlamini's private legal file, Themba asked. Vuyo's jaw tightened. Nokuthula tried the emotional route instead. All I have done is carry an impossible burden while my husband suffered. If I made urgent decisions, it was because nobody else was willing to protect what he built. One board member, Mrs. Sifako, leaned forward then and asked quietly, "Protect it from whom?" For the first time, Nokuthula had no immediate answer. Then came the medical testimony. Dr. Masalela spoke carefully but truthfully. Too carefully for Lerato's taste, perhaps, but enough. Sandile had been more responsive than initially assumed. He had shown signs of increasing comprehension. A fuller, independent review had been justified and completed. Any characterization of him as wholly incapable would now be inaccurate. The external evaluator confirmed it more bluntly. Mr. Dlamini is speech-impaired and physically limited. He is not absent. That sentence landed like judgment. Then Themba called Lorato. Her legs felt numb when she stood. She walked to the witness chair, knowing every polished surface in the room reflected hierarchy back at her. She was poor, jobless, a dismissed maid, a black woman from Katlahong speaking into a room full of wealth about what wealth had done behind closed doors. Still, she sat. Themba asked gently at first. How long had she worked in the Dlamini household? What were her duties? What changes had she observed after Sandile returned from hospital? Then the harder questions came. Had staff been reduced? Yes. Had care been delayed at times? Yes. Had Sandile appeared aware? Yes. Had Nokuthula ever spoken of him in degrading terms? Lorato hesitated only a second. Then she repeated it exactly. You were useful when you were standing. Silence. No one in the room wrote for a moment. Nokuthula's face changed not from sorrow this time, but from rage held in place by costlier instincts. Themba continued. Who had acted during the storm? Lorato. Who had found the governance document? Lorato. Who had been accused and dismissed immediately after outside counsel was contacted? Lorato. Nokuthula's attorney objected twice. Themba answered twice. The chairman of the meeting overruled once. Then Sandile himself lifted his hand. The room stopped. Speaking cost him. Everyone knew that now. So when he chose to do it, no one interrupted. He looked not at Nokuthula, at the board. Then, with devastating slowness and effort, he said, She tells truth. 3 words. Broken. Uneven. Absolute. It was over then, even before the formal motions began. The board did not declare guilt in cinematic thunder. Real power rarely performs itself that way. Instead, one member moved for immediate suspension of all interim governance proposals pending full review. Another moved for the temporary exclusion of Vuyo Kumalo from advisory access. A third requested formal investigation into possible coercive interference in Sandile's care and legal communications. When the vote came, Nokuthula lost the room. Not every hand rose eagerly, but enough did. Enough. By the time the meeting adjourned, the empire she had tried to manage through silence was no longer hers to steer. And as people stood, gathered files, and avoided one another's eyes, Lorato understood that the battle had reached its true center at last. Not whether a rich man would recover, not whether a maid had crossed invisible class lines, but whether truth spoken badly, brokenly, expensively, could still outlive performance. That answer, at least for that day, had been yes. Justice did not arrive like thunder. It arrived the way healing often does in real life, through documents, signatures, exhausted mornings, quiet humiliations finally acknowledged, and the slow rearrangement of power after a lie loses the right audience. In the week after the emergency board meeting, the Dlamini world changed shape. Not all at once, but enough that even the staff at the estate began moving differently. Vuyo Kumalo was formally suspended from any advisory access to company matters pending investigation. His keycard privileges were withdrawn. His calls to certain departments stopped being returned with the same eager speed. Men who had once stood too quickly when he entered now kept their seats a little longer. In wealthy circles, disgrace often begins not with accusation but with distance. Nokuthula did not leave the estate immediately. Women like her rarely surrender a kingdom just because the locks are changing. Instead, she moved through those first days in a silence more dangerous than shouting. She stopped hosting visitors. The charity calls dried up. The carefully curated sympathy around her began to thin as word spread never officially but widely enough that Sandile's condition had been misrepresented, that independent assessments contradicted her narrative, and that legal review had uncovered deeply troubling attempts to redirect authority, while he was still aware. No public scandal exploded in newspapers under giant headlines. Themba had moved quickly enough, and the board had too much interest in containing damage. But in private circles, people knew. And once wealthy society begins to smell moral decay behind polished curtains, invitations change. Calls delay. Faces cool. Doors that once opened without question become selective. Sandile remained at the estate for a short period during the transition, but under a completely different structure. External caregivers rotated in. Dr. Masalela reported to an oversight team, not household whim. Themba controlled legal access tightly. Nokuthula was no longer allowed to manage medical or governance communication without review. The humiliation of that alone nearly hollowed the air around her. Lorato returned not as household staff, but as part of the documented, trusted support team during Sandile's daytime recovery hours. That mattered. Everyone could feel the difference. She no longer reported to Maz Wayne's domestic roster. She did not serve in the dining room. She did not carry trays for Nokutula's guests. Her role was narrow, protective, and clear, assisting Sandile's daily routines under medical guidance, documenting practical observations, and helping maintain stability around a man whose emotional recovery was now understood to be part of his physical progress. And yet, despite the changed title, the whispers did not stop. They simply changed their clothes. Some staff now spoke of her with admiration, others with resentment. A few with fascination sharp enough to wound. Poor people are often generous in crisis, but not always kind. When one of their own begins crossing social boundaries they have been taught are impossible. Lorato felt it in little things. The pause when she entered the kitchen for water. The glances toward her plain clothes when she arrived through the main side entrance instead of the servant corridor. The way one junior maid asked too sweetly whether she would soon move to the big rooms upstairs. Lorato answered none of it. She had no energy left for defending herself to people who had not watched a man fight to breathe in the dark. Besides, Sandile needed all the strength she had. Recovery, once the legal war had shifted, became more human and more brutal in different ways. Without the chaos of manipulation pressing from every direction, Sandile improved faster, but improvement was not magic. It was repetition, sweat, frustration, rage at small tasks, trembling legs, words that still hid behind muscle and injury. Days of progress followed by mornings where he could not bear his own weakness. Afternoons when memory remained sharp but the tongue betrayed him. Nights when old humiliation returned in dreams and made his breathing turn shallow again. Lorato learned the map of those moods. She knew when to speak and when to let silence do kinder work. She knew when to steady his cup without making him feel watched. She knew when to leave him with his pride and when to interrupt that pride before it became punishment. Some afternoons she read business summaries aloud to him, not because he needed distraction, but because Sandile wanted to remain mentally inside the company he had built. Other days she read scripture when the world felt too heavy. Once, when speech practice reduced him to visible fury after the fifth failed attempt at a sentence, he knew perfectly in his mind. She simply sat by the window and said nothing until the storm passed from his face. That was one of the deepest things between them. Not words, not declarations, the absence of performance. One late afternoon, about 3 weeks after the board meeting, Sandile stood for 12 full seconds without gripping the parallel bars. The physiotherapist counted softly. 1, 2, 3. Lorato stood off to the side, hands clasped so tightly they ached. At 8, his knees shook. At 10, sweat ran down the side of his face. At 12, he sat heavily again, breathing like a man who had climbed a mountain no one else in the room could see. But he had done it. The physiotherapist smiled. That is not luck. That is work. Sandile turned his head slowly toward Lorato. He was still too tired to smile properly, but the look in his eyes carried something very close. That evening, after the therapist left and the room quieted, he tried for a sentence again. His speech had improved enough now that words came more often, though still with jagged pauses and effort. You stayed, he said. Lorato adjusted the folded towel in her lap. Yes. He watched her for a moment. Why? It was not suspicion. It was wonder, maybe even sorrow, because men like Sandile spend much of their lives surrounded by people who stay for advantage, fear, salary, prestige, or transaction. Illness had stripped away almost all those disguises around him. What remained had wounded him deeply enough that simple loyalty now looked almost unbelievable. Lorato considered lying with humility. Instead, she told the truth. Because I knew what it looked like when a sick man was treated like he no longer mattered. Sandile held Hargaze. She had told him pieces of her father before, but not all at once. Now, in the quiet recovery room with evening light thinning over the window, she told him more about Sibusiso, the hospital, the apology in his father's voice, the helplessness of poverty, and the kind of grief that never fully closes, because it still suspects something preventable was allowed to happen. Sandile listened without interruption. When she finished, silence sat between them, not awkward, not empty, just full. Then he said slowly, You saw me. The words broke her more than anything grander could have, not because they were romantic, because they were true. Yes, she whispered. Months later, when Nokuthula finally signed the last legal papers ending the marriage, she did not do it dramatically. No courtroom outburst, no social collapse in public, just signatures and retreat. The investigations into financial manipulation and coercive interference did not leave her untouched. Assets were scrutinized. Certain privileges were frozen. Reputational damage followed her quietly but persistently. In the circles that had once admired her elegance, people now watched her with that brittle politeness reserved for those whose masks have slipped too far to be repaired. Lorato did not celebrate. Justice, when real, often leaves sadness behind with the satisfaction. Too much had been destroyed for dancing. It was nearly a full year after the storm before Sandile asked her properly. Not in the fever of crisis. Not from a hospital bed. Not while still legally tied to another woman. He asked her on a winter afternoon in the garden behind the smaller recovery house he had moved into during the last stage of rehabilitation. A simpler property than the old estate, quieter, easier to breathe in, chosen because he said he wanted peace more than grandeur now. The jacaranda branches were bare in the cool light. Tea sat untouched between them because Sandile had spent almost 10 minutes gathering courage into speech, and Lorato recognizing it had not rushed him. By then, he walked with a cane slowly but independently. His speech was still marked by the old injury and moments of fatigue, yet clear enough for the heart of things. "I have been thinking," he said. "That sounds serious." "It is." She smiled faintly, then let the smile go when she saw his face. Sandile looked not like a billionaire, then not like a chairman, not like a man whose name still opened doors across provinces. He looked like a man who had lost almost everything false and was therefore terrifyingly sincere. "When I was ill," he said slowly, "I learned who could leave me while still standing close." Lorato said nothing, and I learned who could remain. When remaining had no reward. Her throat tightened. Sandile set his hand over the cane handle to steady the slight tremor that came when emotion outran control. "I do not want to offer you gratitude and call it love. That would insult both things." Tears rose before she could stop them. He went on, eyes never leaving hers. "I love you, Lorato Maseko. Not because you saved me once. Because when everything proud in me was broken, you still saw a man. And because everything I have rebuilt since then feels more honest when you are near." By the time he reached for the small box in his coat pocket, Lorato was already crying silently. The ring was beautiful, yes. But what undid her was not its value. It was the way Sandile held it, not as a king bestowing favor, but as a man asking humbly for a future he knew he had not earned merely by surviving. "Will you marry me?" he asked. Lorato laughed through tears, a sound full of pain remembered and mercy finally arriving in a shape she had never dared ask for. "Yes," she whispered. Then, clearer, yes. Their wedding, when it came, did not resemble the glittering spectacles wealthy society expected. Sandile refused that. He said he had already lived too long inside rooms where appearance tried to substitute for truth. So, the ceremony was held in a modest chapel garden outside the city, with white flowers open, light clothes, friends, selected staff, who had shown integrity. Themba Doctor, Mazelela Ruth Nomsa Sifo in his first good suit, and Thandi Maseko crying openly in the front row, as if God had personally walked into her grief and rearranged it. Mazwane came too. She wore her best church hat and hugged Lorato after the ceremony with rough tenderness, saying only, "You kept standing." Sandile, in a dark suit, still leaned lightly on a cane for longer walks, but when he took Lorato's hand before the gathered witnesses, there was no weakness in the gesture, only certainty. And when they turned to face the people who had watched them survive separate humiliations, and then one long war together, the room did not see a billionaire rescuing a maid. It saw something rarer, a man rebuilt by truth, a woman honored not for beauty, not for ambition, not for strategy, but for the stubborn dignity of staying human in a world that kept rewarding performance over compassion. Later, when the guests had eaten and laughed and cried and the light softened toward evening, Sandile found Lorato alone for a moment beneath the garden trees. "You know," he said, voice easier now, "they will still talk." Lorato smiled. "Let them." He smiled too. And that, perhaps, was the final healing. Not that the world had become kind, but that at last, neither of them needed its permission to live in the truth they had paid so much to reach. What makes this story unforgettable is not the wealth, the betrayal, or even the final wedding. It is the quiet truth at the center of it. Life reveals the real heart of a person. When strength is gone, status is shaken, and there is nothing impressive left to gain. Sandile had power, influence, and a name that opened doors. But when sickness took away his voice, his movement, and his control, he discovered a painful reality many people never want to face. Not everyone who stands beside you truly stands with you. Some people love comfort, position, and advantage more than they love the human being in front of them. And sometimes, the person who saves your life is not the one the world respects most, but the one with the purest heart. Lorato's strength did not come from money, education, or social status. It came from compassion, memory, and conscience. She knew what suffering looked like, and instead of turning away, she stayed. She chose kindness when nobody was watching. She chose loyalty when it brought her pain. She chose truth when lies could have protected her. That is what makes her love so powerful. It was never built on ambition. It was built on humanity. This story reminds us that dignity is one of the greatest gifts we can give another person. Sometimes people do not need grand speeches, perfect solutions, or public sympathy. Sometimes they simply need someone who will not abandon them in their lowest moment, someone who will still see them as worthy when the world has started treating them like a burden. It also teaches that justice may be delayed, but truth has a strange endurance. Lies can control a room for a season. They can manipulate appearances, influence opinions, and silence the weak. But when truth finally stands up, even with a trembling voice, it carries a power that performance can never imitate. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments what part moved you the most, and what lesson will stay with you after this ending. And if you believe stories about pain, healing, hope, and justice deserve a place in this world, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey.